Hamilcar and Hannibal. The History of the Carthaginian Generals Who Brought Rome to Its Knees. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Michelle Humphreys. Introduction. Carthage was one of the great ancient civilizations, and at its peak, the wealthy Carthaginian Empire dominated the Mediterranean against the likes of Greece and Rome, with commercial enterprises and influence stretching from Spain to Turkey. In fact, at several points in history, it had a very real chance of replacing the fledgling Roman Empire or the failing Greek city-states altogether as master of the Mediterranean. Although Carthage by far preferred to exert economic pressure and influence before resorting to direct military power, and even went so far as to rely primarily on mercenary armies paid with its vast wealth for much of its history, it nonetheless produced a number of outstanding generals, from the likes of Hanno Magnus to, of course, the great bogeyman of Roman nightmares himself, Hannibal. However, the Carthaginians' foreign policy had one fatal flaw. They had a knack over the centuries of picking the worst enemies to fight. The first serious clash of civilizations Carthage faced was against Greece, which rapidly became hostile when the Carthaginians began pushing to spread their influence towards the colonies known as Magna Graecia, Great Greece. Those colonies had been established in southern Italy and Sicily by several Greek poleis, and these territories would become a casus belli for the First Punic War. Certain foreign policy decisions led to continuing enmity between Carthage and the burgeoning power of Rome, and what followed was a series of wars which turned from a battle for Mediterranean hegemony into an all-out struggle for survival. Although the Romans gained the upper hand in the wake of the First Punic War, the Carthaginians brought the Romans to their knees for over a decade during the Second Punic War. Of course, they were led in Italy by the legendary Hannibal Barca, who maintained his army near Rome for nearly 15 years, but never attempted to march on Rome. One overlooked figure in the Punic Wars is Hamilcar Barca, who is now best remembered for being Hannibal's father. However, before Hannibal marched out of Spain, it was Hamilcar who had positioned forces there, and he was already a significant historical figure in his own right. Indeed, had it not been for his death, his legacy likely would have been more important than that of his illustrious son, who is now remembered as one of history's greatest generals. In the history of war, only a select few men always make the list of greatest generals, including Napoleon, Caesar, and Alexander, but they are always joined by Hannibal, who has the distinction of being the only man who nearly brought Rome to its knees before its decline almost 700 years later. Rome never suffered a more horrifying defeat in its history than at Cannae, and indeed, Hannibal nearly rewrote the course of Western history during the Second Punic War. Even today, there remains great debate on just how he accomplished his masterful invasion of Italy across the Alps. Since his army included war elephants, historians still argue over exactly where and how he crossed over 2,000 years after he managed that incredible feat. While military historians are still amazed that he was able to maintain his army in Italy near Rome for nearly 15 years, scholars are still puzzled over some of his decisions, including why he never attempted to march on Rome in the first place. When Hannibal had been in Italy, it had been relatively easy for the Carthaginian oligarchy, particularly the 104, a federation of powerful traders, and Hannibal's chief political rival, Hanno the Great, to marginalize him. For years, his political party, the Barcids, had struggled to obtain even a token amount of funds and troops for his enterprise, but Hannibal's arrival on the scene changed all that. Even his rivals could not deny the simple fact that, all else aside, the man could fight a battle like no other general alive. With Rome threatening invasion, Hannibal was suddenly the necessary hero of the hour. Bolstering his Italian mercenaries with levies from Africa and Carthage, the Carthaginian ruling elite desperately invested the money that Hannibal had begged for throughout the last decade in order to assemble a scratch force capable of at least presenting an appearance of force against Scipio Africanus's army. Hannibal can hardly have been thrilled to see the amount of trouble the Carthaginians went to in order to assemble an army that, had he had his way years before, might well have been completely unnecessary. Certainly it appears that he prepared to take the field with less than his customary ardor. At 45, he was still far from old, but ever since he had first left Carthage, he had spent virtually all of his adult life fighting, and the strain was beginning to tell. By all accounts, he was in poor health and prone to sickness. Indeed, rather than seek to bring Scipio to battle, Hannibal met the Roman general and attempted to talk peace. The army the Carthaginians had succeeded in gathering, not to mention the presence of Hannibal himself, convinced the Roman commander that he might be well advised to seek a diplomatic solution, and the two began negotiations, which were helped by the fact that both generals recognized a kindred spirit in the other. Through negotiations, Carthage was forced to give up much, especially considering Hannibal's roster of victories. But Rome's star was on the rise once again, and Hannibal knew he could not hope to win a protracted war. Hannibal agreed to the Romans' terms. Carthage would lose possession of Iberia and the Mediterranean islands, renouncing all claims to overseas territories, but maintaining its heartland and African possessions, with the exception of the Numidian kingdom of Massinissa, who had declared for Rome. Reparations would be made to Rome itself and to the countless families which Carthage's wars had decimated, and the Carthaginian army and fleet must both be reduced in numbers, in order for them to never again threaten Rome's supremacy. Hannibal, who recognized these terms, though harsh, as probably the best deal Carthage was likely to achieve, acceded to them, but the proposed peace between him and Scipio never happened. While the negotiations were going on, a Roman fleet which had gotten itself stranded upon the coast of Tunisia was seized by the Carthaginian navy and ransacked of all its supplies and equipment. When Scipio heard of this, he furiously demanded reparations, but unaccountably, the Carthaginian oligarchy high-handedly turned him down. Perhaps they felt secure enough with Hannibal at the head of an army on Carthaginian soil to defy Rome, or perhaps the terms of the treaty stung their pride. Whatever their reasons, they could not have committed a bigger diplomatic error if they had gone out of their way to do so. Scipio departed the negotiations in a rage. There would be no terms. Thus, on October 19th, on the plain of Zama in modern Tunisia, battle was joined. For the first time in one of the battles of the Second Punic War, Hannibal had the infantry advantage and Rome had the cavalry advantage. The result would decide the fate of the Second Punic War and the course of history. The founders. The Phoenicians are primarily known in the modern world for creating the oldest confirmed alphabet used as the basis for Arabic script, the Greek and Latin alphabets, and subsequent scripts developed from these. However, they were, for a significant period, also the most important commercial power in the Mediterranean world, responsible for founding a number of colonies, the most important being Carthage. Contrary to claims made in the Old Testament, the Phoenicians were not sons of Ham, but Canaanites. They were a Semitic people speaking a Semitic language. They settled on a narrow strip of land between the mountains of Lebanon and the sea in what came to be known as Phoenicia. It was the Greeks who gave them the name of Phoenicians, meaning dark-skinned, and they were definitely not autochthonous. However, the specific date around which they arrived is still unknown. Phoenicia was well placed for trade as it lay halfway between the Hittites to the north and the Egyptians to the south, and it was a natural stopping-off point for the many caravan routes through which trade in the Middle East flowed. Lebanon was also blessed with a particularly important natural resource, cedar trees, ideal for shipbuilding. Phoenicia became the hub for trade in incense, myrrh, and onyx from Arabia, precious stones, spices, ivory, and perfumed wood from India, horses' linen and cotton from Egypt, gold, ebony, ivory, and slaves from Africa, and wheat and silver from Spain. In addition, Phoenician traders visited as far afield as Austria and Germany, England, the Caucasus, and all the neighboring Middle Eastern states. The Phoenicians also provided manufactured goods, and their factories turned out consumer goods in large quantities. Their Phoenician vases, jewels, necklaces, bracelets, brooches, images of the gods, and textiles in particular came to be highly prized. Their specialties were transparent glass made from the fine white sand found on the coast, and Tyrian purple, a dye made from the murex, which provided the purple color unique to Phoenician mollusks. Their builders were much sought after, and Phoenicians reputedly worked on Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. As well as building specific monuments, they were contracted to build ports and fleets, such as that of the king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Sennacherib of Assyria, who entrusted them with the building of his Persian Gulf fleet. Such high volumes of trade necessitated the keeping of records, and the Phoenicians traded in writing materials, using papyrus from Egypt to replace clay tablets as the main material for recording transactions. Much of this trade in papyrus centered on the city of Byblos, and its name is where the word book derives from. However, it was the related development of the alphabet that proved the most historically significant, as this became the basis for the Hebrew, Greek, Etruscan, Latin, and Cyrillic alphabets. Given this immense contribution to world literacy, it is devastating that all Phoenician literature has been lost to the modern world. Today, only the Maltese language retains some aspects of the original Phoenician language. Significantly, there was no definitive Phoenician state. Instead, there were numerous relatively small towns and cities spread along the coast, all more or less independent but united through their worship of the same gods. According to various Roman and Greek sources, Phoenicians and later Carthaginians sacrificed infants to their gods. Plutarch refers to the practice, as do others, including Tertullian, Plato, and Quintus Curtius Rufus. Livy and Polybius, however, do not. While the bones of many infants have been found in Carthaginian archaeological sites, their cause of death remains a topic of fierce debate. In a child cemetery called the Tophet, the word means roasting place, an estimated 20,000 urns have been uncovered. The Bible asserts that children were sacrificed at the Tophet to the god Moloch. According to Diodorus Siculus's Bibliotheca Historica, there was in their city a bronze image of Cronus extending its hands, palms up and sloping toward the ground, so that each of the children when placed thereon rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. Plutarch, however, argued that the children were already dead at the time, having been killed by their parents or with their permission. Modern academics are divided over the issue of infant sacrifice, and there is a growing opinion that the claim was, in fact, a deliberate propaganda invention of the Romans to discredit their enemies. The sites of Phoenician settlements were all very similar, either on islands close to the coast with good anchorage, such as Tyre, or on headlands with a good anchorage that was easier to defend, such as Byblos and Sidon. At various times in history, the Phoenicians came under the sway of larger powers, such as the Egyptians and the Hittites, but nonetheless, through their favorable geographic position, they were still able to develop their trade, largely through founding settlements overseas. Some were essentially concessions, as in Memphis in Egypt, while others were trading stations, some of which then went on to become colonies that expanded into surrounding areas, such as Carthage. Phoenician settlements have been found in Cyprus, Crete, and throughout Asia Minor. At Gades, in modern-day Cadiz, archaeologists have dated its foundations to as early as 1100 BC. Trading stations have also been unearthed in Sardinia, Malta, Gozo, Pantelleria, Sicily, and Ibiza. The Mediterranean rivalry. Carthage was almost certainly founded during the colonization boom of the Phoenician Empire. This was a movement which took advantage of the relative collapse in the fortunes of Greece, Crete, and the Hittite Empire to establish a string of up to 3,000 colonies between Asia Minor and Spain, and Carthage was conveniently positioned smack in the middle of the extremely lucrative Iberia-Asia Minor raw metals route. Although it was a convenient position, Carthage itself was apparently not intended to be anything special in terms of colonizing efforts, particularly because the Phoenician colonial method differed radically from the Greek variant. While the Hellenes would create a settlement that was self-sustaining and almost always self-governing, while still retaining ties of alliance and friendship with the so-called mother city on mainland Greece, the Phoenicians, both for administrative control reasons and due to population constraints, did not, as a rule, create self-sufficient colonies. Instead, the Phoenicians exerted more control over the settlements, particularly when it came to trade regulations. Thus, the settlement which gradually spread upon the hill of Byrsa was very low in the food chain. From 850 to 650 BC, Carthage gradually became more and more wealthy thanks to her privileged position straddling the major land and sea trade routes of the Mediterranean. These 2 centuries saw the emergence of what would later become known as Punic culture, a distinctly West African Phoenician identity which differed noticeably from its predecessor. The growth of this culture indicated a rise in influence on Carthage's part, and that rise manifested itself in 650 BC when Carthage founded its own independent colony, a settlement on Ibiza, without assistance from Tyre. As the fortunes of Tyre and the Phoenician Empire waned, first with the loss of Sicily to the ever-expanding Greeks, and then with Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon's great siege of Tyre in 585 BC, Carthage's fortunes continued to rise. More settlements were founded, more cities of the North African seaboard were brought under direct Carthaginian control rather than paying their dues to Tyre, and a large colony was established in Syrtis, between Tunisia and Libya. Additionally, Carthage's rise was bolstered by the influx of a large number of immigrants of both wealth and high political status from Tyre itself, as many of the elite fled the conflicts which enveloped the Phoenician capital. For centuries, Carthage's expansion had progressed relatively smoothly, with no one challenging their dominion over the Mediterranean. Even the Etruscans, whose heyday coincided with Carthage's rise to prominence, had not vied with the Punic Empire for supremacy. In fact, the Etruscans had become valued trading partners and then allies, despite several incidents involving pirates. However, near the end of the 6th century BC, a new power was emerging on the Mediterranean with hitherto unseen forcefulness, swallowing up the Etruscan cities and pursuing a policy of ruthless military expansion which threatened to upset the balance of power for good. The Carthaginian elite felt nervous enough watching the rapid growth of Rome that in 509 BC, a treaty, the first of several, was signed between Carthage and Rome. Although at the time, Carthage was far more significant both politically and militarily, an ally on the Italian mainland who would be both belligerent and at odds with the Greeks was certainly useful. The treaty itself was similar to others that the Carthaginians had signed with various states throughout the Mediterranean, and it served to limit the sphere of influence and commercial enterprise each power was meant to abide by. In 348 BC, Carthage signed another treaty with Rome, which was now quickly becoming the dominant power in Italy. Rome gained trade access, but not settlement rights, to Sicily, while Carthage maintained a monopoly on trade in Iberia and Sardinia. Rome also gained valuable Latin possessions from the treaty, further cementing its position as a dominant Italian power. This initially cordial relationship, however, would prove to be far from lasting. Inevitably, Carthage and Rome would be locked in a mortal struggle that would define one city and ruin the other. Sicily was largely at peace, barring the occasional skirmish, for several decades after the peace with Agathocles, but Carthage had plenty of internal and external threats to worry about, not least the burgeoning power of Rome, despite their peace treaty. Another treaty was allegedly signed in 306 BC, but its authenticity is questionable. Sicily was not a problem again until around 280 BC, when Carthage launched a renewed attack on the Sicilian city-states, seizing Acragas and besieging Syracuse. Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, was busy waging war against the Roman Republic in southern Italy when he received a request for aid from several Sicilian poleis, Syracuse among them, against Carthage. Pyrrhus sailed for Sicily with a vast army, forcing Mago, the Carthaginian general, to lift the siege of Syracuse. Pyrrhus then captured Eryx and demanded that Carthage quit the island of Sicily entirely. When these terms were refused, he once again defeated the Carthaginian army in the field in 276 BC. However, Pyrrhus, able general though he was, had made himself increasingly unpopular among the Sicilian poleis, both for his blatant power-grabbing and for his cavalier treatment of allies, so much so that he was forced to depart from Sicily. Pyrrhus's fleet suffered a heavy defeat at sea at the hands of the Carthaginian navy, and he would go on to a crippling campaign in southern Italy, which eventually resulted in Rome absorbing virtually the entire lower half of the Italian peninsula into its own domains, bringing its borders onto Carthage's Sicilian doorstep. Something had to give. After a period of increased tension, the inevitable war finally erupted in 264 BC, and with the domination of many of the city-states, and with only Syracuse the true threat, the Carthaginians decided that they had invested far too much money, time, and effort in their war against the Greek city-states to simply abandon the field. Carthage, with its eyes firmly resting upon a future ripe with financial possibilities, as well as the ability to allow Carthaginian colonization, settled in for the long haul. Shortly after the decision was made to continue the effort, though, the ruler of Syracuse died, and as far as the Carthaginians knew, the resistance had ended. This was not the case. A group of Italian mercenaries who had been hired by the city of Syracuse started to make their way back to Italy when they stopped in the city of Messana, which offered them rest and hospitality before continuing their journey. The mercenaries took advantage of the situation and treacherously seized Messana. They expelled or slew the male inhabitants, divided their wives and children, and took control of the city. These mercenaries decided to call themselves the Children of Maimers, or Mars, and sought to establish themselves as a power. Carthage disagreed with that plan. When Carthage learned of the treachery of the mercenaries, they started to march upon the city of Messana. It was the Carthaginians' intent to punish and capture those mercenaries that they could. The mercenaries, upon discovering that they were now in the path of Carthage's fury, found their courage wanting. The mercenaries decided to petition Rome to intercede upon their behalf. The mercenaries reminded the Roman Senate in their plea that the mercenaries were Italians and that it was the responsibility and duty of Rome to come to their aid. To leave the mercenaries to the fate which Carthage was going to dictate would show that Rome had no power over Sicily, and that, more importantly, Rome was ignoring its responsibilities to watch out for its Latin brethren. For its part, Carthage was not concerned with any plea that the mercenaries made. Carthage believed that the treachery of the mercenaries, so foreign to the rigorous decorum and high moral standards of the Roman culture, would prohibit the Roman Senate from voting to send any sort of assistance to the mercenaries. However, Rome's reasons for fighting the First Punic War were as clear-cut as Carthage's. Rome sought to not only protect its own holdings in Sicily, as well as their allies, they were also concerned about either the Greeks or the Carthaginians increasing their strength on the island. Such a buildup of strength would directly affect the safety of Rome itself. In addition to protecting itself, Rome also had economic reasons. Obtaining more influence on Sicily would increase trade and the ability to export materials to new markets. City-states defeated would not only be allied to Rome, but some of the conquered states' lands would be doled out to worthy Roman citizens. Thus, when the Italians who had seized Messana sent a delegation to the Roman Senate seeking assistance, the Roman Senate could not refuse to protect Italians who appealed to them avowedly as the head of the Italian Confederation for aid against the Greeks and Carthaginians. The Roman Senate, honor-bound, could not look calmly on while the city of Messana fell into the hands of the Carthaginians. Understanding these needs, the Roman consuls found that they were able to raise a patriotic cry of Italians against foreigners. With this public backing, the Roman government could successfully prepare the state for war against Carthage. In addition to the requirements of Roman honor, there was the basic necessity to maintain the protective barrier around the city of Rome. The Roman Senate understood that the city of Messana could be used by the Carthaginians as a standing menace to their Roman power and a vantage ground in the great conflict. The Roman government was quite sure this would be the case in the near future. Originally, Carthage was a monarchy, but by the 5th century BC, it had a form of government not dissimilar to that of Republican Rome. It had suffetes as chief magistrates rather than consuls, a senate, and an assembly, and a board of judges was formed after an unsuccessful military coup to control army commanders. Around the same time as the introduction of the Board of Judges, the policy of relying on mercenaries rather than troops raised from the population was introduced. The exception was the Sacred Band, a unit akin to the Praetorian Guard made up of Carthaginian aristocrats. Aristotle analyzed the constitution of Carthage and seemed impressed by what he observed. The choice of leaders depended on eminence rather than age, and those who were co-opted into office served for lengthy periods. Indeed, those in office should be not only the most efficient, but also the wealthiest, and Aristotle argued that only the rich could be good rulers and have the time to devote to their duties. Of course, this seems to ignore the fact that the Carthaginian system lent itself to corruption, where the highest offices were for sale, and those who bought power inevitably demanded a return on their investment. Hamilcar hailed from a family jockeying for power within this structure, and the absence of Carthaginian sources and a general scarcity of information regarding the background of the Barca family has ensured that the origins of the powerful dynasty have attracted scholarly interest recently. Plenty of the attention has concentrated on the actual origin of the name Barca itself. Some suggestions state it comes from the city of Bars, a Cyrenaic city, while others conclude that since Hamilcar was the first notable historical figure to have the name Barca, it could have been a nickname, meaning lightning in his case. The rationale behind this conclusion is that the name derives from a Phoenician word equivalent to the Greek epithet keraunos, although there is an absence of primary sources referencing this idea. That said, the fact that the name Barca was passed on to Hamilcar's sons indicates it was likely a family name. As for his first name, Hamilcar is the Latinization of Hamilcus, the Hellenized form of the common Semitic Phoenician Carthaginian masculine given name that means Melkart's brother. Hamilcar's family is thought to have come from Cyrenaica, possibly settling in Carthage as late as the 3rd century BC. Textual evidence coming from Polybius and Diodorus could explain the family's apparent animosity toward the Carthaginian Council of Elders and their departure to Spain. What is certainly known is that Hamilcar's family was well established in Carthage by the 3rd century BC, and they were one of the leading families in the city's ruling oligarchy, coming to prominence during the First Punic War, largely due to their open hostility towards Rome. They argued that the rising new power of Rome constituted a serious threat to Carthage's mercantile power, and that Rome had to be confronted and contained at all costs. Hamilcar Barca lived from 275 to 228 BC and served as a Carthaginian general in both the First Punic War and the subsequent Mercenary War. The name of Hamilcar's wife is unknown, but together they had 6 children, including 3 sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago, each of which became famous military leaders in their own right. Their 3 daughters married family allies. His eldest daughter's name is also unknown, but she married Bomilcar and became the mother of Hanno the Explorer. Another daughter married Hasdrubal the Fair. His youngest daughter, supposedly named Salambo, married Naravas, a Numidian chieftain. Hamilcar's personal rise would be directly linked to his actions and leadership in the First Punic War. The First Punic War. In the First Punic War, as in previous conflicts, Carthage had relied upon the hiring of mercenary troops. These troops, coming from all around the Mediterranean and specializing in a wide array of weapons and tactics, were commanded by their own native officers. The various mercenary units, however, were under the command of a professional Carthaginian soldier. On Sicily, the Carthaginians had landed their mercenary units, but never together or with a clearly designed or coordinated plan of attack. The Battle of Agrigentum also caused a shift in policy among the Carthaginian military elite. Rather than face the legions on land, they would attempt to resolve the conflict at sea, where their massive and highly proficient professional navy had the advantage. That said, with few positions of strength remaining to them on the island, the Carthaginian forces under the command of the Carthaginian Hamilcar Barca opted to attack Italy. By using the Carthaginian navy and its skill upon the seas, Hamilcar launched a series of raids along the Italian coast in an effort to bring the war home to the Romans and to force Rome to withdraw its forces from Sicily. Rome did not withdraw, however, nor did it relinquish any territory which it had gained. Instead, it held firmly onto the conquests they had made on land. That said, by 260 BC, it was clear that the war's focus would switch to the sea. Indeed, as it would turn out, the decisive actions in the First Punic War were on the seas. For Rome, the First Punic War was the beginning of its martial navy. While Rome had sailors who were fairly adept at plying the trade routes through the Mediterranean, they didn't enjoy any sort of maritime prowess in regards to warfare upon the sea. Upon the outbreak of war with Carthage, however, this all changed. The Carthaginians were the undeniable superpower on the Mediterranean and had been for centuries. They could, quite literally, sail circles around the Roman navy at the beginning of the war. The Romans, however, were quick learners, something the Carthaginians discovered to their detriment, and the First Punic War saw the largest naval engagements until the 20th century. At the beginning of the war, the Carthaginian navy, manned by native Carthaginians and not mercenaries, were fully capable of defeating the few ships which the Romans were able to launch. The Carthaginian navy was also able to force the Roman troopships off of their marks, making them land farther from their intended destinations or forcing them to attempt night crossings, which were always dangerous even for the most skilled sailors. Rome, however, soon learned how to build ships equal to the Carthaginians through the capture of the Carthaginian ship. The Roman navy was dealt a crushing defeat at the Battle of Lipara, but Rome did not take this defeat lying down. Instead, the Senate authorized a massive financial package for the navy, boosting wartime production to hitherto untold and virtually unsustainable levels, so that more than 100 Roman triremes were constructed within less than 2 months, a monumental undertaking. Once Rome had the ships, however, the Romans still needed to find experienced captains and crews to use those ships effectively, so a stopgap solution was developed: the corvus. Rather than ram the enemy ships and try to sink them, the Roman galleys would close alongside the Carthaginians and then drop the corvus, a hook-ended bridge, onto the enemy deck, linking the ships together. Once that was in place, Roman legionaries would swarm across the bridge, effectively turning a naval battle into a land one and returning the combat to terms which were favorable to them. The Carthaginians suffered grievously at the hands of this brilliantly simple device, though it was eventually phased out of service as the Roman navy became as adept as its Punic counterpart, and would gradually lose supremacy on the Mediterranean over the duration of the war. By 257 BC, Carthaginians had ceased their raids upon Italy, and a year later, the Romans decided to test their burgeoning naval skills once more in what would be known as the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, perhaps the largest naval battle in all of antiquity. Both fleets were of such immense size that each one had 2 separate commanders. For the Roman fleet, these commanders were the consuls Marcus Atalius Regulus and Lucius Manlius, while the Carthaginian commanders were Hanno and Hamilcar. Both Hanno and Hamilcar were battle-tested commanders, while the consuls were elected officials. The forces were evenly matched in spite of the Roman navy's relative youth and inexperience, and the battle was a long and fierce fight. Eventually, the Romans defeated the Carthaginians and drove them away from the Italian coast, taking hold of the ships abandoned by the Carthaginians and adding them to their fleet. With their victory at Ecnomus, Rome had successfully driven the war away from Italy and opened the path to North Africa, which would let them bring the war to the Carthaginians. With the sea lanes to North Africa open, the Romans prepared an invasion force to assault the Carthaginian home territory, and in 255 BC they landed their legions in North Africa, seeking to crush the Carthaginians. Naturally, the Carthaginians did not wait while Rome moved towards Carthage. The city's government sought out a commander for their mercenary army and chose a Spartan-trained general, a Greek mercenary by the name of Xanthippos. The Carthaginians, changing their policy of keeping only a Carthaginian in the position of supreme command, hired Xanthippos, and brought him to Carthage. Once in the city, Xanthippus went amongst the mercenaries, some of whom he had fought with, and others whom he had fought against. These mercenaries knew the merits and victories of Xanthippus and gave him a measure of respect that no Carthaginian could hope to command, and this respect translated to rapid responses to his orders. This helped bring about the crucial Carthaginian victory in the Battle of Tunis in 255 BC. At that battle, nearly half of the Roman army and the consul Regulus were captured by Xanthippus's troops. The surviving legionaries, about 5,000 men, dug into a position which they could easily defend, and shortly after the battle, the remaining Roman troops were rescued by a portion of the Roman fleet. The Roman defeat at the hands of Xanthippus marked the end of Roman efforts in North Africa. By the next year, the Carthaginian army returned to Sicily in an effort to take back their lost holdings and to seize the entire island. At the same time, Carthage made the decision to release Xanthippus, so in 251 BC, Hasdrubal was the commander of the Carthaginian forces on Sicily. In the northwest of Sicily, the Roman and Carthaginian forces met in the Battle of Panormus, and Hasdrubal's troops were defeated and pushed back, eliciting an attempt at peace negotiations from the Carthaginians. This gesture was made through the release of the consul Regulus, who had been captured at the Battle of Tunis. Hamilcar took sole command of Carthaginian land forces in Sicily in 247 BC, and for the next 6 years he kept his army intact and led a successful guerrilla war against the Romans. When Hamilcar first arrived in Sicily, the Carthaginians had temporarily regained control of the seas, but on land they only held the cities of Lilybaeum and Drepanum. He was somewhat hampered by the internal wranglings of the ruling aristocracy as to where Carthaginian resources should be focused. Those favoring an expansionist policy in North Africa, led by Hanno II, who was also pro-Rome, won out over those who favored Hamilcar's option for using their restored naval dominance to retake the areas of Sicily they had lost and then took the war into Italy. The rivalry for control of Carthage's foreign policy between Hanno's aristocratic peace party and Hamilcar's supporters, mainly the merchant class and ordinary citizens, would shape Carthaginian politics for years to come. At the time, Carthage found it hard to sustain the war on its two major fronts. In addition to maintaining a fleet and an army in Sicily, they had to deal with Libyans and Numidians in northern Africa. The lack of resources to deal with both threats meant Hamilcar was only given a small army to defend Sicily, and the Carthaginian fleet was gradually withdrawn. By 242 BC, Carthage had virtually no naval presence left in Sicily. Hamilcar based himself near Panormus in 247 BC, at a time when many in Carthage believed there was no point in sending a large force to Sicily. With such a small force and no money with which to hire new troops, Hamilcar's strategic goal was basically limited to maintaining a stalemate. He was frustrated by the fact he had neither the means to prosecute the war, nor did he have the delegated authority to reach a peaceful settlement. The troops he did have were almost entirely mercenaries drawn from numerous nations. However, Hamilcar's leadership skills were first revealed in his ability to shape the unprepossessing collection into an effective fighting force, while his tactical genius proved invaluable in the war against the Romans in Sicily. Military strategists have long compared Hamilcar's employment of combined arms tactics to similar approaches used by Alexander the Great and Pyrrhus. The difference is that Roman commander Quintus Fabius Maximus had a much larger force than his adversary, no supply problems, and room to maneuver, while Hamilcar was hemmed in, had a far smaller army than the Romans, and was dependent on seaborne supplies from Carthage, which proved unreliable. Having arrived to find a dispirited and disgruntled army, Hamilcar's first task upon taking up command in the summer of 247 BC was to deal with the rebellion of the mercenary troops, who were exasperated at Carthage's failure to pay them. Hamilcar took decisive action, murdering some of the ringleaders at night, drowning many others at sea, and dispersing more in different parts of North Africa. Another major task was to enhance the spirit of the army in the process of creating a highly disciplined and versatile force. He built a bastion named Hircte near Panormus, from which he organized his guerrilla war against the Romans for the next several years. Hamilcar's occupation of the height of Hircte has been explored in a number of academic works, with 4 possible locations being identified as the actual site of the fort. Hamilcar was said to have decided on his site when returning from a raid on the Italian coast. Its commanding position beside the sea made it the ideal spot, as there was also a sheltered bay at the foot of the mountain where he could build a naval station. Polybius recorded the site as being at or over Hircte between Eryx and by the sea at Panormus, and he described the mountain as a steep height rising from the surrounding country to a considerable height. Of this, the circumference of the top crest is not under 100 stades. The site enclosed by which is well pastured and cultivable, lying suitably protected against the sea winds, quite spared from life-threatening animals. Both the seaside and the side looking inland had inaccessible cliffs, while the other sides needed only slight and limited preparation for an effective defense. A hillock served as a citadel and observation point, with the position commanding a convenient harbor for the trip from Drepana and Lilybaeum to Italy, in which there exists a plentiful supply of water. Hamilcar was not, however, content to sit in his impregnable fortress, and he began planning and carrying out raids to disrupt the Romans, going even beyond Sicily. For example, he raided Locri in Bruttium and the area around Brindisi in 247 BC, and he also carried out seaborne raids ranging from Catana in Sicily to Cumae in central Italy. On the other hand, Hamilcar did not allow himself to be drawn into a large set-piece battle, so he won no major confrontation and recaptured no cities lost to the Romans during this period. Instead, he waged a relentless hit-and-run campaign that proved a constant drain on Roman resources. A Roman army led by consuls Marcus Autocilius Crassus and Marcus Fabius Licinius failed against Hamilcar in 246 BC, and the consuls in 245 BC, Marcus Fabius Buteo and Attilius Bulbus, fared no better. In the following year, Hamilcar moved his army to the slopes of Mount Eryx at night to provide support to the besieged garrison in the neighboring town of Drepana. He then retook the town of Eryx, which had been captured by the Romans a few years earlier, and evacuated the population to Drepana. Hamilcar continued his campaign from his new base for another 2 years. While Drepana kept him resupplied, by that time all Carthaginian ships had been recalled, so he was unable to launch any seaborne raids. A well-known story of Hamilcar's attitude comes from a raid authorized by him, but led by an officer named Bodostor. Hamilcar had given instructions that troops were not to plunder but simply attack, inflict damage, and retire quickly. Bodostor disobeyed his instructions, and his force was caught by the Romans, who inflicted heavy casualties on the Carthaginians. Hamilcar asked for a truce to bury the dead, but the Roman consul Fundanius refused, saying that Hamilcar should request a truce to save the living. Hamilcar responded by attacking and inflicting severe casualties on the Romans. When Fundanius requested a truce to bury his dead in turn, Hamilcar replied that his quarrel was only with the living, and the dead had already settled their dues. He subsequently granted the truce. The Romans' inability to defeat Hamilcar or take the remaining Carthaginian-held cities resulted in their decision to construct a new fleet in 243 BC and consolidate control of the sea and cut all of Hamilcar's links to home. Whether due to this new initiative or the constant raiding, Celtic mercenaries tried unsuccessfully to let the Romans into the Carthaginian base. Hamilcar had to promise huge rewards to keep the rest of his army loyal, but this tactic would later have severe repercussions. By then, Rome was very nearly bankrupt and had to borrow from its wealthiest citizens to build a new fleet of 200 quinqueremes. The fleet enabled the Romans to seize the harbors at Drepana and Lilybaeum, while Roman soldiers built siege works around Drepanum. The belated attempt by the Carthaginians to counter the Roman fleet failed at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC. A battle confirming and completing Sicily's isolation from Carthage. From the Carthaginian perspective, the situation was untenable, and it was Hamilcar who was delegated to open negotiations with Roman commander Gaius Lutatius Catulus. In turn, Hamilcar nominated Gisco, a Carthaginian commander of Lilybaeum, to lead the talks. Hamilcar's reluctance to put himself at the head of the negotiating team was arguably based on the fact that Carthage often brought defeated generals and admirals before the tribunal of 100 and had them crucified. It is not surprising that Hamilcar was keen to protect himself from that possibility if the Roman terms proved unacceptably harsh. The Peace of Lutatius was a treaty intended to replace all other treaties between the two combatants. Initially, the Romans demanded that the Carthaginians leave Sicily entirely and commit to never attacking Syracuse or Rome's allies. In addition, Carthage was required to pay Rome 2,200 Euboean silver talents, approximately 56 tons, over a 20-year period as reparations. The Carthaginian troops were to lay down all weapons, and any Roman deserters were to be handed over. Hamilcar refused the last two conditions. Lutatius then threatened to have the Carthaginian troops pass under the yoke. Hamilcar still would not agree. Lutatius relented, and Carthaginian soldiers were later allowed to leave Sicily under arms. In effect, Hamilcar secured the concession that the Carthaginian army could retire without tokens of submission. The Comitia Centuriata in Rome, however, would not ratify the agreement negotiated, and a commission led by Quintius Lutatius Circo, brother of the consul and consul himself in 240 BC, amended the treaty and added new conditions. Carthage would evacuate all islands between Italy and Sicily and pay 2,200 silver talents in 10-year installments, with 1,000 talents to be paid up front. Carthaginians held by Rome were to be ransomed, but any Romans held by Carthage had to be freed without payment. All Carthaginian warships were excluded from Italian coastal waters and those of their allies. The injunction not to make war on allies was retained in the new proposals, and a directive banning Carthaginian involvement in the internal affairs of allies was added. There were further detailed conditions, including a provision that neither side would seek to recruit soldiers, levy tributes, or build public buildings on the other's territories. Polybius suggests this final clause replaced the one specifying that Carthage would not attack Syracuse. Hamilcar argued for the clause, possibly to save face, given that the new conditions imposed by Rome were harsher than those originally agreed upon. Alongside his forces in Drepana and Eryx at Lilybaeum, Hamilcar surrendered, and he returned to Carthage, leaving Gisco to organize the evacuation of mercenaries to Africa. When he reached Carthage, he announced his retirement. However, his mercenaries were unhappy at what they considered to be his abandoning them, and they were not prepared to simply accept the situation. The Mercenary War. The result of the First Punic War was a complete dearth of money in Carthage, which was a serious problem because Carthage relied chiefly on mercenary armies. Thousands of mercenaries throughout the Carthaginian Empire were suddenly not getting their wages, and the result was inevitable. War. An all-out insurrection of mercenary contingents throughout the Punic Empire, including Iberia, Sardinia, and Corsica, and a renewed attack from the subjugated Libyan tribes followed. Suddenly, Carthage was fighting for its very life and grudgingly accepting military and financial aid from her two old enemies, Syracuse and Rome. Ironically, Hamilcar's success had made the mercenary war possible in the first place. Hamilcar was not defeated in Sicily in the conventional sense, so the number of his troops had not been reduced to any great extent, leaving an army of approximately 20,000 angry and frustrated soldiers wanting the pay due them. Hamilcar organized the return of troops to Carthage through General Hasdrubal Gisco, arranging for practical small groups to be sent at a time. Hamilcar's thinking was that the city would spread out the payments, avoiding direct clashes and preventing the whole force from joining together. Carthaginian authorities, however, waited until the whole army had gathered, probably in the summer of 241 BC, and tried to get the mercenaries to accept less than Hamilcar had promised. As the strain of maintaining the army increased, Carthaginian authorities sent the mercenaries off to Sicca, once more pleading with them to forego all of their unpaid wages because the settlement with Rome had impoverished the city. The discipline Hamilcar achieved with the mercenaries had broken down, and when Hanno the Great made it absolutely clear that Carthage would not honor Hamilcar's promises over wages, they marched on Tunis in September of 241 BC, and the mercenaries even refused to accept Hamilcar as an arbitrator, angered by his refusal to accompany his army from Sicily and his retirement to Carthage as soon as the treaty with Rome had been formalized. Panicking at the nearness of such a hostile force, the Senate agreed to pay in full, but the mercenaries responded by demanding even more. Hasdrubal Gisco, who had a good reputation with the army, was brought over from Sicily in late 241 BC and sent to the camp with enough money to pay most of what was owed. He distributed what he had available and promised that the balance would be paid as soon as possible. It is highly probable the revolt would have ended at that point, if not for Spendius and Mathos's intervention. Spendius was an escaped Roman slave who had joined the Carthaginian army in the First Punic War at some point prior to 241 BC, and though Spendius's date of birth is unknown, as are most details of his activities prior to his coming to prominence as the mutiny's leader, he was elected co-general with an African named Mathos. Mathos was a Libyan, recruited into the Carthaginian army during the First Punic War like Spendius, at some point prior to 241 BC, and as an African, he was well placed to incite rebellion between Carthage's North African possessions, and they responded to his call by providing him with provisions, money, and 70,000 troops. The ensuing war lasted 4 years. Hamilcar was appointed joint commander of the Carthaginian army alongside Hanno, but there was no cooperation between the two. While Hanno confronted Mathos in the north near Hippo, Hamilcar concentrated on retaking towns defecting to the rebels. Spendius continued to avoid any large battles, which proved wise as when he was eventually brought to a battle, he lost over 10,000 men, and 4,000 were captured. From the time of his appointment, Hamilcar offered captured mercenaries the option of joining his army or being transported to their homelands. The two rebel leaders decided that such leniency could well undermine their forces, so to prompt a reaction from Hamilcar, they had 700 Carthaginian prisoners, including Hasdrubal Gisco, tortured to death. They had their hands cut off, they were castrated, their legs were broken, and they were thrown into a pit and buried alive. As intended, the Carthaginians killed their prisoners, and from then on, neither side showed any mercy. The unusual ferocity of the fighting caused Polybius to term it the Truceless War. All subsequent prisoners taken by the Carthaginians were trampled to death by elephants. The Carthaginians eventually trapped Spendius in a pass known as the Saw. Without any supplies or the possibility of getting any, the rebels ate their horses, their prisoners, and then their slaves, hoping Mathos would rescue them from his base in Tunis. Spendius and Autorytus finally arranged a meeting with Hamilcar to discuss terms of surrender. The whole entourage was taken prisoner and crucified within sight of the defenders in Tunis. The leaderless rebels then attempted to fight their way out in the Battle of the Saw and were massacred. In 239 BC, the previously loyal cities of Utica and Hippo murdered their Carthaginian garrisons and joined the rebels. The Romans declined the city's offer to occupy it. It was at that point that Mathos made the decision to move his base of operations to Tunis. Hamilcar laid siege to Tunis in late 238 BC, but he abandoned it soon thereafter. Despite the siege being lifted, few supplies were getting through, and Mathos decided the situation untenable. He led the army to the port city of Leptis Parva, just south of the modern city of Monastir in Tunisia. Hanno and Hamilcar finally agreed to work together, and their combined forces marched after them with an army of 25,000, including every Carthaginian citizen of military age. Mathos decided to gamble everything on one battle, but it was a disastrous loss. Hamilcar and Hanno agreed that on this occasion they would not execute those captured. Instead, they would be sold into slavery. Mathos was, however, different. After his capture, he was dragged through the streets of Carthage before being tortured to death. Iberia. As the mercenary war was coming to a close, Carthage was hit by a series of other disasters in 239 BC. Its fleet and supply flotilla bringing supplies from Emporia sunk in a storm, and more significantly, the mercenaries in Sardinia rebelled. The rebels besieged Boster, and when it fell, all Carthaginians defending the citadel were executed. All Carthaginian territories in Sardinia were captured, one by one. Carthage sent a newly recruited mercenary force under Hanno to retake the island in 239 BC, but they too rebelled, killing Hanno and the Carthaginian officers. The rebels then asked Rome to take over Sardinia, but they were refused, as was a similar request from Utica. Up to that point, Rome had scrupulously adhered to the terms of the treaty that ended the First Punic War and even sent supplies to Carthage to help with the fight during the mercenary war. The mercenaries in Sardinia did not treat the local population well, thus provoking them to turn on the rebels, and they were successful in forcing them to leave the island in 237 BC when they retreated to mainland Italy, and again asked Rome to support them in retaking the island. On that occasion, despite treaty obligations, the Romans seized Sardinia and Corsica and demanded that Carthage pay 1,200 talents for its refusal to renounce its claim on the islands. The local population on both islands tried to fight off the Roman takeover, but without assistance from Carthage, it was an impossible task. The Romans' actions set the scene for the Second Punic War, but the more immediate consequences were felt in Carthage itself. The aristocratic party had dominated Carthaginian politics since 248 BC, with its nobles consistently advocating a policy of appeasement with Rome, even if it meant giving up territories. The policy was to minimize Sicilian operations while Hamilcar was in command, reduce the navy, and support Hanno the Great's conquests in Africa. This approach contributed to Carthage's ultimate defeat in the First Punic War. They had remained in power throughout the mercenary war and generally opposed Hamilcar's more aggressive policies. Hamilcar did, however, have his supporters, particularly in the mercantile class, whose interests lay in holding on to Carthaginian-controlled territory. Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, emerged as the nominal leader of the group, but it was Hamilcar who shaped policy. Flying in the face of facts, the aristocratic party blamed the loss in the First Punic War, the mismanagement of the mercenaries that had led to the mercenary war, and the rebellion in Sardinia on Hamilcar, but the popularity he enjoyed amongst the people thwarted any attempt to put him on trial. Hamilcar, along with Hasdrubal, managed to engineer a restriction of the power of the aristocracy and secure immunity from prosecution for himself and his officers. Hamilcar's faction was strong enough to ensure that he could implement his next plans. While he prioritized the payment of the war indemnity so the Romans would have no excuse to interfere in Carthaginian affairs, he firmly believed that further conflict with Rome was inevitable, and he began preparing Carthage for that eventuality. He obtained permission from the Senate to recruit and train a new army, ostensibly to secure Carthage's North African possessions, when he, in fact, had a far more ambitious goal in mind. Hamilcar decided that the way to restore Carthage's power and prepare for the next round with Rome was to develop its Spanish assets and become a more overt imperial power. Spain was rich in timber, mines, and men, and he believed that the Romans could hardly object if they wanted Carthage to continue paying the huge war reparations demanded of Carthage if it tried to increase its revenues. Just as importantly, Hamilcar recognized that even if the Carthaginians lacked the necessary sea power, Italy could be reached directly by land from Spain, which might prove invaluable in future conflicts. The fact that Spain was some distance from both Carthage and Rome also appealed to Hamilcar, who intended to build surreptitiously for the future. Without the consent of the Carthaginian Senate, he ferried his army from North Africa to Gades in 236 BC, where he hoped to build a new empire to compensate Carthage for the loss of Sicily and Sardinia. Prior to his departure from Carthage, Hamilcar made sacrifices to the gods. Though he was a child, Hannibal had begged his father to accompany the expedition to Spain. At first, it appears as though Hamilcar was reluctant to let someone so young join him on his campaign, but due to repeated pleas by Hannibal, he seems to have relented. Whatever his reasons, the young Hannibal was certainly with the Carthaginian army when it marched along the coast of North Africa to the Strait of Gibraltar, where, under Hamilcar's supervision, the troops were ferried across the narrow strait and onto Spanish soil. The journey took Hamilcar's army some months, but at the time the Carthaginian navy was in such a parlous state that there were simply not enough ships available to transport the army by sea from Carthage itself, leading Hamilcar to take the longer coastal route. Hamilcar landed near modern Cadiz in the summer of 237 BC, at a time when Carthage had lost control of the territories it had before the First Punic War, so Hamilcar presented the military invasion as simply retaking what Carthage had previously held. Phoenician settlements, founded in many cases centuries earlier along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts of southern Spain, were, in the main, trading posts. Although they might control a limited area around the settlement, they had no direct control over the tribes inhabiting the wider areas of the peninsula. At this time, many of the Iberian and Celtiberian tribes were not unified and notoriously warlike. In addition, the Phoenicians had been in competition with the Greeks, especially those from Massalia, in trade and the foundation of settlements. Phocian Greeks had built colonies in Catalonia, at Minca near Malaga, and 3 colonies near the mouth of Sucro. The rivalry between the Greeks and Phoenicians had led to the Phoenicians allying with the Etruscans to push the Greeks out of Corsica and destroy the colony at Manchi. By 490 BC, Massalia had defeated Carthage twice, and a boundary along Cape Now in Iberia was agreed upon. Massalia became closer to Rome over the years, and by 237 BC, the two were allies in all but name. This relationship was a significant factor in the politics of the region. Hamilcar's immediate objective in Iberia was to gain access to the gold and silver mines of the Sierra Morena. Negotiations with the Tartessian tribes proved successful, probably because they had well-established links with the Phoenicians and their heirs, the Carthaginians. Tartessos, or Tartessus, at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River was a harbor city controlling the Iberian Peninsula's south coast. This is mentioned in sources from Greece and the Near East beginning in the first millennium BC. Archaeological finds in the region have confirmed that the Tartessian culture was well established, and to date, 97 inscriptions have been discovered in the Tartessian language. The Tartessians were also rich in metal, and in the 4th century BC, the historian Ephorus described Tartessos as having a plentiful supply of tin, gold, and copper brought from Celtic lands. Trade in tin was vital since it is an essential component of bronze and is comparatively rare. Several early sources refer to Tartessos as a river. Herodotus claimed that it rose in the Pyrenees and flowed out to sea outside the Pillars of Hercules. However, no such river now flows, and there is no evidence that one ever did. Writing in the 2nd century AD, Pausanias gave specific details of the location of the city. They say that Tartessus is a river in the land of the Iberians, running down into the sea by 2 mouths, and that between these 2 mouths lies a city of the same name. The river, which is the largest in Iberia and tidal, those of a later day called Baetis, and there are some who think that Tartessus was the ancient name of Carpia, a city of the Iberians. The river, known in his day as the Baetis, is now the Guadalquivir. One theory is that Tartessos may have been buried under the shifting wetlands. The river delta has been gradually blocked by a sandbar stretching from the mouth of the Rio Tinto near Palos de la Frontera to the riverbank opposite Sanlúcar de Barrameda. In the 1st century AD, Pliny the Elder incorrectly identified the city of Cartea as Tartessos. The site of Gades was deliberately built by the Phoenicians to be near Tartessos on the island of Erythea, northwest of Gibraltar at the tip of the Iberian Peninsula. It is thought to be one of the most ancient of cities still standing in Western Europe. Some sources place its founding by the Phoenicians of Tyre in the 8th century BC, while others suggest it might date from around 1100 BC. but either way, it was primarily a seasonal trading post, providing the Phoenicians with access to the vast mineral wealth of the area. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Greeks and Romans did not accept the Phoenician version of the city's origins, claiming it had been founded as a result of one of the 12 labors of Hercules, the 10th of which required him to capture the cattle owned by the three-headed monster Geryon and take them to Eurystheus, the king of Mycenae. This labor involved his traveling the known world, and when he arrived at the western end of the Mediterranean, he created the Pillars of Hercules, also known as the Gates of Cadiz. After capturing the cattle, Hercules built a huge mountain, and when he split it apart, he brought about the separation of the continents of Europe and Africa, thereby connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean via the Strait of Gibraltar. The legend does not actually address the issue of who built the city, but all archaeological evidence indicates it was the Phoenicians. The city became a battleground for control of the western Mediterranean Sea. With the decline of the Phoenicians in the east and the rise of Carthage in the west, the status of the site changed, and in 500 BC, it was integrated into the growing Carthaginian Empire. This provided Hamilcar with a ready-made base for his forays into southern Iberia. However, his negotiations were not as successful with the Turduli as they had been with Tartessos. Quoted by Strabo in the 1st century AD, Pythias claimed the ancestral homeland of the Turduli was located north of Turdetania, the region where the kingdom of Tartessos was located in the Baetis River Valley. The Turdetani, or Turduli, tribe near the foothills of modern Seville and Cordoba were implacably opposed to Hamilcar. They had support from a number of Celtiberian tribes and were under the command of Istolaccio. Hamilcar defeated these allied tribes, killed the leaders, and either released captured prisoners or incorporated them into his own army. His next opponent was another confederation of Celtic tribes, but this time their leader was Indortus, possibly Istolaccio's brother, who was able to field a force of nearly 50,000. Immediately after defeating the Turduli, Hamilcar invaded the land of the Lusitanians and the Vitones, part of modern-day Portugal, without opposition. But when he returned to the south, Indortes was waiting with his army. Despite his numerical advantage, Indortes retreated to higher ground. The Carthaginians surrounded him, and battle commenced. Indortes and much of his army turned tail and escaped. Hamilcar pursued and captured Indortes, had him tortured, blinded, and finally crucified. Hamilcar continued with this policy of inflicting savage cruelty on leaders opposing him, but offering generous terms to the ordinary troops. After defeating Indortes, 10,000 erstwhile foes joined Hamilcar, and all local cities allied with him. Having secured control over the mines as well as the river routes of Guadalquivir and Guadalete, giving access to the mining area, Gades began minting silver coins in 237 BC, but Carthaginians took control of the mines and introduced new technologies to increase the production. Control of the mines meant that Hamilcar could pay for his mercenary army, as well as send silver ore back to Carthage to help pay off the war indemnity. In so doing, he stifled any excuse Rome might have had for interference in Carthaginian affairs. Hamilcar quickly consolidated his position in southern Iberia to the extent that, in 236 BC, he could send Hasdrubal the Fair with an army to Africa to put down a Numidian rebellion. Hasdrubal defeated the rebels, killing 8,000 and taking 2,000 prisoners before returning to Iberia. After subduing Turdetania, Hamilcar moved east toward Cape Now, meeting fierce resistance all along his route. Even previously friendly tribes, such as the Bastatani, refused to allow him unchallenged progress through their land. There followed 4 years of constant campaigning, resulting in the total subjugation of the area between Gades and Cape Now. During those years, Hamilcar created a professional army of Iberians, Africans, Numidians, and other mercenaries that his son Hannibal would later lead across the Alps. By 231 BC, Hamilcar had consolidated his Iberian territorial gains and founded the city of Acre Leuca, modern-day Alicante. In securing the area, Hamilcar also took over areas surrounding a number of Massalian colonies near the mouth of Sucro River. Massalia was so alarmed by the Carthaginian advance that it reported its concerns to the Romans, who finally decided to investigate the matter. While Hamilcar was busy campaigning in Iberia, Rome was busy trying to consolidate its control in Sardinia, Corsica, and Liguria, where the locals continued to put up stiff resistance to the Roman occupation. Rome suspected the Carthaginians of aiding the insurrectionists and sent embassies to Carthage throughout the 230s BC, accusing them of interference and threatening reprisals if it did not stop. In 231 BC, a Roman embassy was sent to Hamilcar in Spain to inquire about what he was up to and what his intentions in the peninsula were. Hamilcar replied that his only goal was to gather enough booty to pay off the war indemnity. The Romans were apparently happy with his assurances and withdrew. Hamilcar's campaigns continued successfully, and he even began to consolidate his gains by founding a string of cities, including, popular legend has it, the port city of Barcino, perhaps a derivation of Barca, his family name, on the site of modern-day Barcelona. After the foundation of Acre-Loic, Hamilcar moved northwest, but there are no records of his subsequent campaigns. During this time, Hannibal grew to adolescence, tutored in warfare by Greek instructors who instructed him by detailing the conquests of Alexander the Great, Alcibiades, and Pyrrhus of Epirus, all of whom he would come to greatly admire and hold in high esteem. Of course, Hannibal also witnessed his father Hamilcar's successes as a commander firsthand. It is likely that Hamilcar himself, when campaign matters permitted, would have taken time to instruct his son himself, for they appear to have been close. Indeed, Hamilcar was determined that Hannibal himself, when the time came, should take up his mantle and proceed with the crusade that had occupied most of his military life, the destruction of Rome. Hamilcar had never recovered from the humiliation of being defeated by the Republic's forces, and he longed for the day when he might lead Carthage's troops against Rome once again. To this end, he spent much time instilling in his son an implacable hatred of Carthage's sworn enemy. Such was Hamilcar's zeal for his cause, and his desire to bind his son to it, that he had Hannibal accompany him to a shrine in the town of Pensacola, near modern Valencia, and bid him swear upon the altar that he would be Rome's enemy forever. Hannibal duly did so, adding, "As soon as I have come of age, I swear that I will bring Rome low by fire and the sword." In the winter of 228 BC, Hasdrubal the Fair was sent on a separate campaign, while Hamilcar besieged an Iberian town before sending most of his troops to winter quarters at Acre-Loica. Meanwhile, the leadership of Celtic tribes opposed to Hamilcar fell to Orisius. The first mention of him is in reference to the aid he provided to the city of Helice, which was besieged by Hamilcar at that same year. He may have fought alongside Installacio and Indortes, but he was an able and cunning commander, more so than either of them. Orisius pretended to want an alliance with Hamilcar, but as soon as he felt the Carthaginians had lowered their guard, he attacked and dealt Hamilcar his first defeat in Iberia. The Carthaginians tried to use their war elephants in battle, but Orisius came up with a strategy to counter them by driving a herd of fighting bulls with torches on their horns into the elephants. The elephants stampeded in panic, causing chaos in the Carthaginian lines and burning their camp. For some historians, this is the battle in which Hamilcar died, but there are other accounts. For example, those by Diodorus and Appian say he drowned in a river when he fell from his horse while being pursued by the Oretans. Zonaras asserted that Hamilcar died in the Carthaginian camp while escaping from his own rampaging elephants. Finally, Polybius argued that all of these accounts are false, and Hamilcar survived the battle but was killed sometime later in another battle against Iberian tribesmen. Modern historians believe it is likely Hamilcar died in battle against the Vettoni, who lived across the Tagus, west of Toledo, north of Turduli, and northwest of Oretani territory. His death would be avenged the following year in 227 BC, when Orisius was decisively beaten by Hasdrubal the Fair, commanding an army of 50,000 men, 6,000 horsemen, and 200 elephants. Oresius was executed on the basis that he had been the primary cause of Hamilcar's death, and the 12 cities he controlled had fallen to the Carthaginians. In a relatively short span of 8 years, Hamilcar had secured a large expanse of territory in Iberia using a combination of military force and diplomacy, and despite his premature death, he succeeded in restoring Carthage's financial situation to the extent that it could contemplate fighting Rome again. As such, Hamilcar's plan to extend Carthaginian control over more of Iberia did not end upon his death. Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal, took command in the wake of Hamilcar's death and quickly took territory up to the river Ebro. The Greek colonies became even more agitated, and they appealed to Massalia, who then appealed to Rome to curtail the Carthaginian aggression. At the time, Rome had no territory in either Gaul or Spain, which meant their concerns were primarily economic and related to the possibility that Carthage could regain the preeminent position it had held prior to the First Punic War. A very specific problem was tin, which was a highly strategic material because a mixture of 10% tin to 90% copper was needed to make bronze, the essential alloy used to make non-rusting weapons. Copper was readily available, but tin, for Massalia, came almost exclusively from Cornwall. The route from Cornwall was via Brittany and then down the west coast of Gaul, skirting the Pyrenees, then around Carcassonne before reaching its destination. Both the Massalians and the Romans were concerned that any Carthaginian advance beyond the Ebro would put this vital trade route at considerable risk. In 226 BC, a Roman delegation met with Hasdrubal to negotiate a settlement of the issue. At that meeting, it was agreed that the Roman sphere of influence would extend as far as the northern bank of the Ebro, while Carthaginian influence was to stop at the southern bank. However, there was one problem, in the form of Zakynthos, later Saguntum. This Greek city lay south of the Ebro, putting it within the Carthaginian sphere of influence, but it would prove pivotal in leading the Carthaginians and Romans to renew their hostilities in what became the Second Punic War. It appears likely that around 225 BC, Hasdrubal began plotting with the Gauls of the Po Valley in the north of Italy, the only as yet unconquered area in the Italian peninsula, to launch an attack on Rome with Carthaginian backing. But the Senate got wind of the plan and ordered a preemptive strike of their own, leading to a 5-year war, which eventually led to the annexation of the Po Valley. Hasdrubal himself was assassinated in 221 BC, possibly with Roman collusion. Rather than solve the Romans' problems, however, Hasdrubal's death brought about the rise of the most famous Carthaginian of all. Hasdrubal was succeeded by his brother-in-law and Hamilcar's son, Hannibal. In 237 BC, legend has it that when Hamilcar was about to set off to Spain, Hannibal, then 9 years old, begged his father to take him with him. Hamilcar was about to offer a sacrifice to the gods to ensure the success of his campaign, and although he refused his son's request, he did place Hannibal's hand on the animal to be sacrificed and asked him to swear that he would never forget that Rome was the enemy. Whether that legend is true, the Barcids no doubt felt Carthaginian humiliation at the hands of the Romans very deeply, and all of Hamilcar's sons opposed Rome throughout their lives. Hannibal proved to be a natural military genius and a leader who inspired his men with his personal bravery and his willingness to share all their daily hardships. He was elected as leader by the troops without the permission of the Carthaginian Senate, but the politicians at home could not do anything other than endorse their choice. This method of choosing their own leader reinforces the idea that leadership in the Iberian Peninsula was a kind of personal dictatorship vested in the Barca family. Cornelius Nepos claimed that Hannibal was a scholar as well as a soldier, and this assertion ties in with the level of statesmanship that he exhibited in the latter part of his career. He was taught Greek by Soselos, and it is said he wrote books in Greek. For 2 years, Hannibal bided his time, consolidating his position in the Iberian Peninsula and massing his forces, abiding by one of the greatest military truths, and one which doubtless his tutors and his father, with their tales of Alexander and Alcibiades, had contributed to instill in him. numbers do not matter so much as concentration of force. After all, the army sizes don't matter if troops are not available to fight in one single critical location at any given time. Meanwhile, even as Hannibal was preparing to strike out against their very heart, the Romans seem to have grown unusually complacent. To a sense, this may have been rational, as Hannibal was new to overall command, and with both Hamilcar and Hasdrubal dead, the Romans must have felt themselves secure. The troops that Hannibal commanded were professional soldiers who fought for pay and plunder rather than any particular state or political ideal. They comprised a relatively small number of Carthaginians, Gauls, Africans, and Iberians. The typical Greek phalanx was the core of the army, and its tactics derived from the hoplite warfare practiced in Greece. However, the most distinctive troops were the Balearic slingers. They used pebbles or leaden bullets and were accurate both over short and long range. It is said that they could hit a target at distances that archers could not match. Their overall firepower was well in excess of anything that contemporary archers could match. The Spaniards tended to provide heavy cavalry with 2 men on horseback, one to fight from the horse and the other to dismount and fight on foot. The Numidians, who came mainly from Algeria and Morocco, were considered the most fearsome of the Carthaginian troops. The term Numidian stems from the word nomad, and they were expert horsemen. Their light cavalry units were swift, and they developed a tactic of charge and retreat that heavily armed hoplite troops could not counter. The most famous Carthaginian units were the fighting elephants. Unlike most fighting elephants previously used in war, which were Indian, the Carthaginian ones were African of the Cyclotis variety known as forest elephants, to distinguish them from the larger bush elephants found in Central and Southern Africa. They were first used by the Carthaginians in the First Punic War at Agrigentum in Sicily in 262 BC, and thereafter were featured in all Carthaginian armies. When Hannibal first took command of the Carthaginian forces, there was still considerable consolidation work to be done in Spain before he could turn his attention to Rome. In 221 BC, he besieged the Oaklades capital of Carthage. The Oaklades tribal area was located south of the Ebro, so in the Carthaginian sphere of influence, but it had not yet been absorbed into the territory controlled by them. By taking this area, he moved right up to the agreed border of Carthaginian-Roman spheres of influence. More importantly for later relationships with Rome, this annexation meant that the city of Saguntum was now surrounded by Carthaginian territory. At the time of the agreement between Rome and Carthage that designated their respective areas, Saguntum, while south of the Ebro, was not adjacent to any Carthaginian territory. Part of the Ebro Treaty stated that neither side should extend its dominion beyond the Ebro, while Saguntum, situated between the empires of the two peoples, should be preserved in independence. Saguntum, along with other Greek cities in the northern part of the east coast that were also concerned about Carthaginian ambitions, allied themselves with Rome for protection. For the time being, however, Hannibal left Saguntum to its own devices and turned his attention to the north of Spain. He crossed the Sierra Morena, past Merida to Salamantica, modern Salamanca, which he captured. He defeated the Vacaei, a tribe based around the River Douro, and then turned south again towards Toledo. The Iberians combined to attack him as he crossed the Tagus, but Hannibal slipped past them and came up behind their lines. The Iberians were routed, and this victory brought the whole of Iberia south of the Ebro under Carthaginian control, with the notable exception of Saguntum. Having secured his base, Hannibal turned his thoughts to how he might implement the plan Hamilcar had conceived to defeat Rome. It combined the elements of initiative and surprise with shock. The main feature of this audacious plan was none other than the concept that the next war with the Romans had to be fought on Italian soil, and the route to Italy had never looked as possible as it did in the first years of Hannibal's leadership. The Gauls, in northern Italy, were already in a state of ferment, and as recently as 225 BC, an alliance of Gallic tribes had invaded Etruria, defeating a Roman army at Faesulae and going on to ravage the countryside. To prevent further invasions, the Senate had ordered the invasion of Cisalpine Gaul, but the Romans insisted on unconditional surrender, and, in due course, Cisalpine Gaul became a province. Roman colonies were established in the newly acquired territory at Placentia, now Piacenza, Cremona, and Mutina, now Modena, to act as a check on the Gauls. Hannibal knew that the Gauls felt humiliated by their defeats and the foundation of Roman colonies, and he was determined to profit from this unrest. He was also aware that the Romans had further difficulties in Illyria and Greece. It seems that the Romans never entertained the thought that the Carthaginians might launch an overland attack on Italy, an attack that would mean crossing the Ebro, the Pyrenees, Gaul, the Rhone, and the Alps to reach their target. Of course, that is precisely what Hannibal was determined to do. Hannibal planned his operation in great secrecy, and the details were worked out meticulously. He gathered information on his intended route to Italy and assessed the fighting capabilities of all potential foes he might encounter on his march. As well as gathering military intelligence, he gathered political intelligence about all the tribes he might have to deal with. He was, naturally, particularly keen to learn of any aversion to Roman rule. All of this information was crucial if he was to plan for a successful march to a destination over 1,000 miles from his base. Practical issues, such as how his army was to be fed until it reached what he assumed would be the welcoming arms of the Cisalpine Gauls, were thought through in minute detail. It is rumored that one of his commanders, Hannibal Monomachus, suggested that the troops should be trained in how to live off human flesh, which, if true, was quickly dismissed by Hannibal. Although Hannibal could rely on the loyalty of his troops, he faced difficulty in persuading the Carthaginian Senate to support his plans. The Senate had numerous members who were determined to maintain the peace with Rome at any price, and a number who resented the Barca family's domination of Iberia. Hannibal was reasonably certain that the Senate would never declare war on Rome, and he knew he had to manipulate the situation to achieve his goal. Hannibal supported an Iberian tribe that had a dispute with Saguntum, and the Saguntines immediately appealed to Rome for help under the terms of the Ebro Treaty, fearing a Carthaginian attack. The Roman Senate duly sent a delegation to Hannibal to remind him that Saguntum was under Roman protection. By the time the envoys arrived in Spain in 219 BC, Hannibal had already laid siege to the city and claimed to be too busy to meet with them. His hope was that the Romans would declare war there and then, but instead the envoys withdrew and sailed to Carthage to complain about their treatment, demand a cessation of hostilities against Saguntum, and ask for Hannibal to be handed over to atone for the breach of the treaty that had ended the First Punic War. Hannibal had alerted his supporters in the Carthaginian Senate of the impending arrival of the Roman delegation, and, forewarned, they ensured that when Rome's demands were made known to the whole Senate, they took immediate offense and declared that the Saguntines were the ones at fault, and that it would be most unwise of Rome to side with them and render null and void the good relations that had been built up in the years following the end of the war. While all of this diplomacy was going on, Hannibal continued with the siege and duly breached its defenses after 8 months. The city was treated savagely, with the population massacred and their belongings looted. Hannibal sent the captured booty back to Carthage to bolster support for his actions. The Roman envoys returned to Rome with Carthage's answer to their demands at approximately the same time news reached Rome of the fall and subsequent sacking of Saguntum. The Roman Senate was incensed and voted to declare war on Carthage, but before engaging in direct conflict, it sent new envoys to Carthage to ascertain whether Hannibal's actions at Saguntum had been carried out on his own initiative or whether they had the support of the Senate. The Carthaginians replied with a legal argument claiming that the treaty between Carthage and Rome required both parties to refrain from interfering with the allies of the other, and that the treaty made no specific mention of Saguntum being an ally of Rome. They also argued that the treaty had never actually been ratified by the Roman Senate. The senior Roman envoy was Quintus Fabius Maximus, who, clearly frustrated by what he regarded as Carthaginian obfuscation, said, "Here we bring you peace or war. Choose which you prefer." The Carthaginians replied that the Romans could choose. Fabius said, "War." The Carthaginians responded, "So be it." Through Hannibal's machinations, the Romans declared the Second Punic War, and on that basis, it could be claimed that it was the Romans who had violated the peace treaty. In the spring of 218 BC, at the head of approximately 50,000 infantry, 15,000 cavalry, and 50 war elephants, Hannibal began marching northeast. His plan was breathtakingly ambitious. He would march through the Pyrenees, across southern Gaul, over the Alps, and into Italy proper, thereby avoiding the heavily fortified border in the northwest of Italy. It was a route no general had ever taken before, let alone a general with so many animals, including elephants. His father Hamilcar had been defeated trying to invade southern Italy and attempting to outfight the Roman navy at sea. Hannibal would not make the same mistake. Rome on the brink. Pushing aside with contemptuous ease the stiff resistance of the Pyrenean tribes, who contested every step of the way from their strongholds of the mountain passes, Hannibal pushed forwards with remarkable speed, leaving behind a detachment of some 10,000 Iberian soldiers to keep his lines of communication open and pacify the tumultuous region. He then marched on into southern Gaul, negotiating with the local chieftains and outfighting those who had a mind to contest his advance. His speed of maneuver and his ability to move his army across rough terrain proved unmatched in the ancient world since the time of Alexander the Great. By that point, his army, which now numbered some 40,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and around 40 war elephants, danced up the valley of the Rhone to evade a Roman force sent to bar his passage southwards through the strategically vital gap in the mountains where the Alps meet the Mediterranean. With that route closed to him, Hannibal, undaunted, struck south and east across the Alps themselves. Exactly what route he took is still the subject of hotly contested debate today, and even Roman scholars writing shortly after his prodigious feat seem to have no clear idea of where precisely he made his passage. But one thing is certain: it was one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history. There were no roads greater than a goat track across the Alps, none of them continuous, and the high passes were smothered by snow, often year-round, with drifts dozens of feet deep. Moreover, those passes included other hazards, such as potential rockfalls, and the barren terrain offered limited supplies. To top it all off, these passes were crawling with bellicose tribesmen who lived by banditry and hid in impregnable fortresses perched atop sheer crags. To Hannibal's army, most of them Iberians from the sun-baked plains of southern Spain or Carthaginians from the hot deserts of northern Africa, the Alps must have looked like an icy hell. Hannibal's passage of the Alps remains the most famous event of his life and legend, and even though the location of his crossing matters little compared to the fact that he ultimately did get across, it has nonetheless been the most compelling mystery of his life for thousands of years. Even ancient historians were intrigued and tried to figure out the answer. Polybius mentioned that Hannibal's men came into conflict with a Celtic tribe, the Allobroges, which was situated near the northern part of the range along the banks of the river Isere. The famous Roman historian Livy, writing over 150 years after Polybius, claimed Hannibal took a southerly route. It is believed that both historians used the same source, a soldier in Hannibal's army, Sosilas of Lacedaemon, who wrote a history of the Second Punic War. Geographers and historians have pointed to the 6 most likely mountain passes that could have actually been used and then tried to narrow it down by finding one that seems to match the descriptions of both Livy and Polybius. A handful of historians used those accounts to theorize that Hannibal crossed the Alps at the Col du Montgenèvre Pass, which would have been in the southern part of the range near northwest Italy. That also happened to be one of the better-known road passes in the ancient world, and it was used often for diplomacy. Wherever the crossing, and despite the innumerable difficulties, Hannibal got across. He reached the rolling foothills of northern Italy several months later at the head of 20,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and a mere handful of war elephants, the great beasts having fared none too well in the mountain passes. If figures relating to his troop numbers before and after his celebrated crossing are to be believed, only half of the men Hannibal marched into the Alps marched back out again, and Hannibal must have known that no supply convoys could ever hope to cross where his army had passed. Nor, with the Roman navy's supremacy in the Mediterranean, could he have much hope of resupply or retreat by sea. Like Caesar would do nearly 170 years later crossing the Rubicon, Hannibal had cast the die. He and his men were left with no choice but victory or death. By the fall of 218 BC, the Carthaginians had reached the Isere River at the foot of the Alps. Realizing that this presented a threat to Italy from the north if Hannibal were able to cross the Alps, Consul Publius Scipio hurried back to Rome to prepare an army to meet a possible invasion from the north, while Gnaeus Scipio took the army into Hispania, where he fought several successful battles against Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal. Hannibal quickly advanced on the main city of the hostile Tauran tribe, present-day Turin. He captured the city and had its surviving inhabitants killed as a lesson to other cities which might choose to stand against him. Taken completely by surprise by Hannibal's sudden appearance in northern Italy, Consul Publius Scipio quickly gathered his legions from their winter quarters and moved north to meet Hannibal. This time he took with him his son, and though Scipio was just 17, this was not unusual despite the young man's inexperience. Roman fathers often took their sons into battle for the Republic as a way of completing their military training. In late November, the two armies met on a flat plain close to the confluence of the Po and Ticino rivers. The army that Hannibal brought to the battle mainly comprised cavalry, around 6,000 strong. The consul commanded around 3,000 Roman cavalry, supported by 7,000 velites, lightly armored infantry provided with javelins. Despite having a numerical superiority, the outcome was a disaster for Rome. The fast-moving Carthaginian cavalry were used cleverly by Hannibal as they focused on the velites and were so effective that the javelin throwers were unable to let loose a single volley. When they broke and fled before the charging cavalry, the velites hampered the deployment of the Roman cavalry. The outcome was a rout. Rome lost almost 3,000 men during the battle, while Hannibal lost only a handful of his cavalry. The Roman survivors fled south back towards Rome, but before the battle was completely over, the young Publius Cornelius Scipio would make his mark. His father was wounded during the battle, and near the closing stages of the fighting, Scipio and his father were cut off from the main Roman force and surrounded by Carthaginian cavalry. With only a few bodyguards to protect him, the consul's death or capture looked certain, which would have been a terrible blow to the city. Young Scipio had been placed in charge of a small troop of Roman cavalry, being kept in reserve on a low hill overlooking the battlefield and watching as the battle developed. Polybius described what happened next. When he caught sight of his father in the battle, surrounded by the enemy and escorted only by 2 or 3 horsemen and dangerously wounded, he at first endeavored to urge those with him to go to the rescue. But when they hung back for a time owing to the large numbers of the enemy round them, he is said with reckless daring to have charged the encircling force alone. Upon the rest being now forced to attack, the enemy were terror-struck and broke up, and Publius Scipio, thus unexpectedly rescued, was the first to salute his son as his deliverer. The Battle of Ticinus was a stunning shock for Rome. This was the first time that a Roman army had met Hannibal in battle, and his tactical brilliance had proved too much for them. The Roman army was respected throughout Italy and beyond, and such a comprehensive defeat was totally unexpected. However, the bravery of Publius Scipio provided some welcome good news. The capture or killing of a serving consul had been avoided, and the young man was hailed as a hero. It seems that his father intended to award him the Corona Civica, civic crown, the highest Roman award for military valor, but the boy refused, saying only that the action was one that rewarded itself. The combination of courage, boldness, and modesty proved irresistible, and young Scipio quickly became wildly popular amongst both the Roman aristocracy and the people. Within 2 years, he would be promoted to the role of tribunus militum, military tribune, an important role that directly served the legatus, the overall commander. Many young Romans served as military tribunes, and this was often seen as a route to the Senate and to political advancement. However, for a young man to achieve this role so quickly was unusual and unexpected, and it was presumably a direct result of the fame brought by his bravery in rescuing his father at the Battle of Ticinus. Personal accolades aside, Rome was now in a precarious position. Emboldened by this Roman defeat, the Gauls of the Po Valley rose in revolt, sending a large force, around 20,000 men, to join Hannibal's army. Hannibal then marched his force south of Scipio's main base at Placentia on the Trebia River, cutting him off from the support of consul Sempronius Longus, who was marching up from southern Italy to come to his aid and bring Hannibal to battle. However, when the provisions promised to his army by the Cisalpine Gauls failed to materialize, Hannibal was forced to abandon his tactically superior position to capture the supply depots at Clastidium, allowing Longus and Scipio to join their forces near the Trebia. Although the Roman Senate was now hurriedly raising legions in Rome, and 2 powerful Roman armies had joined together, Hannibal apparently remained unfazed. He promptly marched on the Roman camp on the Trebia, making a show of force and inviting Scipio and Longus to attack him. The 2 Roman generals obliged, throwing their celebrated infantry across the Trebia in order to attack Hannibal's forces, arrayed on the bluffs above the river. Exhausted by their river crossing, the Roman troops became entangled in a bloody melee with Hannibal's infantry, fighting each other to a standstill until Hannibal unveiled his master stroke. Concealed from the Roman infantry by the terrain until the last moment, his light infantry and cavalry stormed into the Roman flanks, enveloped the entire force, and trapping the legions with their backs to the river, annihilated them. It was a crushing victory for Hannibal and a disaster for Rome. It would be the first of many. By this point, the campaigning season, which traditionally stopped during the winter months, was virtually over. Hannibal decided to winter his troops in Cisalpine Gaul, but he quickly wore out his welcome there. Possibly because the Gauls were displeased at how Hannibal had used their levies to grind down the Roman forces, the supplies they provided were stilted and ungenerous. In early spring, Hannibal decided to find himself a more secure base and made ready to carry the war into Italy proper. However, despite the winter lull, the Romans had not been idle. 2 consular armies, under consuls Servilius and Flaminius, had marched at the beginning of the new year to block Hannibal's routes to the south and east, fortifying their positions there and effectively immuring him within northern Italy. A normal general would have thought himself trapped. Hannibal, however, had a plan. To the south lay the Apennines Mountains and the huge swampy delta of the Arno River in modern Tuscany, an area reckoned impassable by any army. Hannibal must have reckoned that after what he had faced in the Alps, he and his men were ready for any challenge. After a brief pause for consideration, he ordered his army to march for the Arno. The Apennines were less of a challenge than the Alps had been, and Hannibal's forces made decent enough time as they crossed through them, but Hannibal himself suffered a debilitating injury, losing an eye to a virulent infection, believed to be conjunctivitis, that kept him bedridden for a spell. His army then descended into the basin of the Arno, but the going was far harder than even Hannibal could have anticipated. The entire region was a festering swamp, with not a single scrap of dry, solid land for his men and horses to sleep on. Hannibal quickly realized he had marched his men into a death trap. With no choice but to push on, he and his men marched uninterruptedly for 4 days and 3 nights, in water and mud that often came up to their waists, with no rest except what they could snatch on their feet. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of Hannibal's men perished on the march. Some were drowned, others were swallowed by quicksand, others contracted malaria or dysentery from drinking the swampy water, and still more simply died of exhaustion. By the end of the march, Hannibal had lost the last of his war elephants, as well as virtually all of his supplies and wheeled transport, but he was now in Etruria, Roman heartland, with both Flaminius and Servilius to the north of him. As Polybius noted in his account, Hannibal had reached an important crossroad in his campaign. As Polybius wrote, Hannibal calculated that if he passed the camp and made a descent into the district beyond, Flaminius, partly for fear of popular reproach and partly of personal irritation, would be unable to endure watching passively the devastation of the country, but would spontaneously follow him and give him opportunities for attack. Hannibal needed to bring Flaminius to battle, to avoid the danger of having a large enemy force to his rear, but he found Flaminius too passive to give him the battle he sought. In order to persuade the consul, who had a healthy fear of his abilities, to take to the field against him, Hannibal set about ravaging the surrounding Etrurian countryside, sacking towns, burning markets, and generally wreaking havoc in the hope that Flaminius would become so incensed that he would be forced to defend the Italian heartland, or that a direct order should arrive from Rome ordering him to do so. Hannibal, though his military strategy was sound, was not as strong in his political choices as he was in battle. By devastating Etruria, he lost support among the local people, whom he might otherwise have been able to lure away from their alliance to Rome. Moreover, despite Hannibal's best efforts, Flaminius stubbornly stayed put in his defensive position. Frustrated by the Roman general's supineness, Hannibal marched around Flaminius's flank and cut him off from Rome, the kind of turning movement in warfare that was rarely used in the ancient world but became standard fare, and often the ultimate strategic goal, over the next 2,000 years. Even with such a massive threat to his lines of supply and communication, Flaminius still refused to march, so Hannibal turned and marched southwards. This time, with the Senate demanding what exactly he was playing at, Flaminius had no choice but to chase him. Flaminius marched his 30,000 men after Hannibal, but the Carthaginian forces outstripped him. Desperate to bring the enemy to battle, Flaminius pushed recklessly onwards without scouting his line of advance, a mistake which was to cost him dear. On the northern edge of Lake Trasimene, Flaminius marched his army through a narrow defile and onto a small plain that was ringed by wooded mountains, through which his trackers reported Hannibal had marched some time previously. It was only when the last of the Roman forces had marched through the defile that Hannibal swung the jaws of his trap shut. His cavalry rushed forward from concealed positions to close the only gap through which Flaminius's force could retreat, and then his entire army poured howling out of the woods and fell onto the Romans before they had the chance to take up battle positions. In the ensuing desperate melee, virtually the entire Roman army was wiped out. 15,000 or more, including Flaminius himself, were killed, cut down in the melee, or drowned in the lake trying to swim to safety. Around 5,000 more Roman soldiers were captured, and the remainder scattered into the hills. In one masterful stroke, Hannibal had disposed of the last field army in northern Italy, successfully executing antiquity's greatest ambush. Rome herself was now at his mercy. Hannibal was now in an ideal position to strike at Rome, but he chose not to do so. If he ever had any siege artillery in his baggage train, no mention is made of it in the original sources, then he lost it in the Alps or in the swamps of the Arno, because he had none available to invest Rome, nor, apparently, the engineering expertise either among his Carthaginian troops or his Gaulish levies to manufacture any. Without siege engines, he could still have chosen to ring the city with earthworks and lay siege to it, but instead he decided to march into southern Italy, where he hoped to incite revolt among Rome's subject states. In desperation, the Senate did something that had only rarely been done in the past in appointing a dictator to rule Rome. Unlike a consul, a dictator was appointed to rule alone and with absolute power for a period agreed by the Senate. The man chosen was one of Rome's most senior and experienced politicians, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, and he quickly began assembling an army capable of smashing the Carthaginians who were rampaging south through the Italian peninsula. Rather than meet Hannibal in open battle, Fabius Maximus pursued a policy of harassment, attacking supply trains and outposts to undermine Hannibal's power while he gathered a new army. 8 legions were assembled, each consisting of nearly 5,000 men, making it the largest army that Rome had ever sent into the field at that time. Frustrated by the Roman leaders' tactics, Hannibal took out his spite by ravaging the country estates and cities of the Apulian region before making his way into Campania, one of the most important agrarian regions in Italy, because of its vast, fertile plains that produced harvests crucial to feeding the great masses of Rome. Even the threat to the Campanian exports failed to draw Fabius Maximus into open battle, but Hannibal was so overzealous in his harrowing of Campania that, he soon realized, come the winter his army would have nothing to live off. Accordingly, he decided to march back to Apulia, but found his path blocked by a number of different Roman contingents that Fabius Maximus had placed at crucial passes to bar his way back. Hannibal responded with customary brilliance by feinting his entire army at a thickly wooded hill, suggesting he was going to march through the forest and ignore the pass, and when the Roman army repositioned to attempt to bar his way, promptly marched his men about and through the pass they had so obligingly left unguarded, a tactical masterstroke which so damaged Fabius Maximus's already tarnished reputation as a commander that he was forced to step down as dictator. As British historian Adrian Goldsworthy noted, the maneuver was a classic of ancient generalship, finding its way into nearly every historical narrative of the war and being used by later military manuals. Hannibal spent the winter comfortably ensconced in Apulia, raiding the region to procure supplies for his army and making overtures to the Macedonians, the city-states of Syracuse, and many other erstwhile allies of Rome. He needed their help in the hopes they would provide him with men and supplies which were desperately needed since Carthage stubbornly refused to support him. Despite his successes, Hannibal was not particularly politically beloved at home, with many believing he was being too rash in provoking Rome. Frustrated, Hannibal resumed the campaigning season in the spring of 216 BC by capturing the city of Cannae, a crucial supply hub, and placing himself along the line that convoys from the ports and warehouses of the south needed to travel to reach Rome. This was something the Romans could not and did not take lying down. Now, the Roman forces disregarded the delaying tactics that Fabius had favored, fully determined to destroy Hannibal once and for all as quickly as possible. Polybius described the unprecedented nature of this Roman army. The Senate determined to bring 8 legions into the field, which had never been done at Rome before, each legion consisting of 5,000 men besides allies. Most of their wars are decided by one consul and 2 legions, with their quota of allies, and they rarely employ all 4 at one time and on one service. But on this occasion, so great was the alarm and terror of what would happen, they resolved to bring not only 4 but 8 legions into the field. The armies of Rome and Hannibal finally met in August 216 BC near Cannae, and the outcome was the bloodiest battle in history at the time. Despite the massive horde headed his way, Hannibal was ready for them. He encamped his army near the Aufidus, a river not far from the town, and waited. His intelligence told him that Consul Varro, the more influential of the 2 Roman generals, was a firebrand, talented in attack but with a tendency to overreach himself, and Hannibal resolved to use this flaw to his advantage. Hannibal arrayed his army in the open, sure that Varro would be unable to resist the temptation to offer battle, and then deliberately placed his weakest infantry in the center of his battle line. Varro led the Roman legions straight at the center of Hannibal's formation, proceeding in characteristic bull-headed fashion and spearheading the assault himself. Hannibal's troops in the center yielded before the legions, as Hannibal had anticipated, sucking the bulk of the Roman force deep into the center of Hannibal's formation. Meanwhile, the wings of Hannibal's infantry automatically swung against the flanks of the Roman force, while Hannibal's cavalry, led by his celebrated general Maharbal, crushed the Roman cavalry and light infantry deployed to protect the formation's flanks and rear, and, in so doing, succeeded in encircling it completely. The Roman force now found itself unable to run or maneuver, completely surrounded by Hannibal's forces. It was one of the earliest examples of the pincer movement in the history of warfare. Livy described the scene vividly. So many thousands of Romans were dying, some whom their wounds, pinched by the morning cold, had roused as they were rising up, covered with blood, from the midst of the heaps of slain, were overpowered by the enemy. Some were found with their heads plunged into the earth, which they had excavated, having thus, as it appeared, made pits for themselves, and having suffocated themselves. If the casualty numbers are accurate, Hannibal's army slaughtered an average of 600 Roman soldiers every minute until nightfall ended the battle, and less than 15,000 Roman troops escaped, which required cutting their way through the center of Hannibal's army and fleeing to the nearby town of Canusium. The battle is still considered one of the greatest tactical victories in the history of warfare. As military historian Theodore Dodge described, few battles of ancient times are more marked by ability than the Battle of Cannae. The position was such as to place every advantage on Hannibal's side. The manner in which the far from perfect Hispanic and Gallic foot was advanced in a wedge and echelon was first held there and then withdrawn step by step until it had reached the converse position is a simple masterpiece of battle tactics. The advance at the proper moment of the African infantry and its wheel right and left upon the flanks of the disordered and crowded Roman legionaries is far beyond praise. The whole battle, from the Carthaginian standpoint, is a consummate piece of art, having no superior, few equal examples in the history of war. Furthermore, the fact it was a complete victory with the wholesale annihilation of the enemy army made it the textbook example for military commanders to try to duplicate, usually, of course, without success. It was the kind of annihilation that every commander from Caesar to Frederick the Great to Napoleon to Robert E. Lee sought, and that few save Caesar and Napoleon bagged whole armies is a testament as to the near impossibility of achieving a victory like Cannae. Of course, the battle was an unqualified disaster for Rome, unprecedented in the annals of the city, and one with consequences which echoed around the Mediterranean. The Syracusans and Macedonians, now believing that Rome's star was on the wane, abandoned their alliances with the Republic and sided instead with Hannibal. With yet another Roman army decimated, Rome was again at Hannibal's mercy, as Livy noted. Never before, while the city itself was still safe, had there been such excitement and panic within its walls. I shall not attempt to describe it, nor will I weaken the reality by going into details. It was multiplied disaster that was now announced. For according to the reports, 2 consular armies and 2 consuls were lost. There was no longer any Roman camp, any general, any single soldier in existence. Apulia, Samnium, almost the whole of Italy lay at Hannibal's feet. Certainly there is no other nation that would not have succumbed beneath such a weight of calamity. In just 20 months, Hannibal had destroyed 3 Roman armies, totaling about 16 legions and upwards of 200,000 men, and it is estimated that Rome had lost 20% of its adult men. Once again, however, Hannibal inexplicably wavered and opted not to attack Rome itself. Though he still lacked siege equipment, there would almost certainly have been someone among his allies with expertise in siege warfare, but Hannibal refused to march north, choosing instead to stay in southern Italy. Much of the blame for Hannibal's supineness in this case remains with the Carthaginian oligarchy, who once again refused to provide him with money, reinforcements, or the siege equipment he so vitally needed. According to legend, after the annihilation of the Roman force, the Numidian cavalry commander Maharbal suggested that Hannibal march on Rome. When Hannibal resisted, Maharbal was alleged to have said, "Truly the gods have not bestowed all things upon the same person. Thou knowest indeed, Hannibal, how to conquer, but thou knowest not how to make use of your victory." Of the whole Roman army, only 4,000 cavalry escaped from the battle with their weapons and made their way back to Rome, including Scipio. It's not known what his role was during the battle, but it seems that the survivors elected young Scipio their leader, so he led the way back to Rome. When they arrived back in Rome, the city was understandably in a state of panic. People were openly saying that Rome was finished, and some younger patricians who had gathered around Lucius Caecilius Metellus were considering moving to another city and serving under a foreign king. Many members of the Senate believed that the only sensible course of action was to try to make peace with Hannibal, whatever the terms. This was Rome's darkest hour. Almost alone, young Scipio believed that the situation could be salvaged. Although he was just 20, he addressed the Senate, as was his right as a member of one of the 5 great families. Referring to their desire to make peace with Hannibal, he said that it is not a proper subject for deliberation, that courage and action, and not deliberation, were necessary in such a calamity, that those who desired the safety of the state would attend him in arms forthwith. Next, he confronted Lucius Caecilius Metellus and the group of patricians who were considering defecting to another city. He burst in on a meeting of the group, sword in hand, and told them, "I swear that I will neither desert the cause of Rome, nor allow any other citizen of Rome to desert it. I insist that you, Lucius Caecilius, and the rest of you present, take this oath, and let the man who demurs be assured that this sword is drawn against him." The patricians seemed more terrified of Publius Scipio than they were of Hannibal, and they did as he instructed. Somehow Scipio was able to calm the Senate and the people of Rome and persuade them that they could not only fight on against Hannibal, but that they could also defeat Carthage. He had no authority to do these things, and it seems that he succeeded by force of will alone. At a time when Rome desperately needed strong leadership, Publius Scipio stepped forward and provided it. In 213 BC, he stood for the position of aedilis curulus, a role responsible for maintaining public order in Rome. Technically, he was too young to stand, but such was his popularity that he was elected unanimously. That said, Rome still had to deal with plenty of misfortunes. The consul elected for 215 BC, Lucius Postumius Albinus, was killed alongside his whole army of 25,000 during an ambush by tribes allied with Hannibal in Gaul. The bad news continued when Scipio's father and uncle were killed in battle with Carthaginian forces in Spain. By 211 BC, Hannibal controlled most of the Italian peninsula and the bulk of Spain, and he had concluded alliances with the main tribes in Gaul to the north, though he had not yet attempted a direct attack on the city of Rome itself. When elections were held in Rome for the position of proconsul, a regional leader for territory outside the Italian peninsula controlled by Rome, there were few positions available due to the loss of territory to Hannibal. Despite this, for one region, Hispania, the situation seemed so hopeless that there were no candidates. Noting this, the 24-year-old Scipio decided to stand, though technically he was too young and lacked the qualifying experience for such a role. However, his performance after the defeat at Cannae had made him so popular and so revered for his courage and determination that he was unanimously elected. For the first time, Publius Scipio would serve as a military commander, though the forces at his command were relatively small and greatly dispirited after a string of defeats at the hands of Hannibal's brother, Hannibal Barca. As a soldier, the 2 battles in which Scipio had participated were serious defeats for Rome. As a commander, he would never fight a losing battle. Taking the fight to Spain. Scipio arrived in Hispania with reinforcements of 10,000 men to supplement the legions already stationed there, and he immediately began to show his acumen as a leader. Despite his youth, his strategic grasp of the situation was clear. Hispania was the key to defeating Hannibal in Italy. All his supplies and reinforcements came from that area, so if the Carthaginians could be defeated in Hispania, it would become much easier to defeat Hannibal in Italy. Basing himself in Tarraco, where he arrived in late 211 BC, Scipio spent the winter touring the encampments of his forces and visiting Roman allies in the area. He also spent time analyzing the forces opposing him. The main leader of Carthaginian forces was Hannibal Barca, but another of Hannibal's brothers, Mago, and a general from another noble Carthaginian family, Hasdrubal Gisco, each commanded their own armies. All three were jealous of the others, and each sought glory for themselves. Scipio became aware that these three factions tended to operate independently, rarely coming to the support of the others, and he quickly realized that it would be possible to fight all three separately. By late 210 BC, he had planned his campaign, but he revealed the details to no one, fearful that the news would spread. His plan was not, as most people expected, to attack the largest army of Hasdrubal, but instead to focus on the main Carthaginian city in Hispania, which was New Carthage. His analysis had determined that none of the three Carthaginian armies were within 10 days' march of New Carthage, so he figured that if he moved quickly and without warning, he might be able to seize the city with little bloodshed. New Carthage was the main source of communication and supply between the Carthaginians in Hispania, their homeland, and Hannibal's forces in Italy. It was also the main supply depot for Carthaginian forces in Hispania, meaning its capture would be a major blow to Carthage. Scipio moved fast, crossing the Iber River in early 209 BC and marching his army of 25,000 men southwest along the Mediterranean coast to New Carthage. His arrival there was completely unexpected, and he discovered that the city was guarded by less than 1,000 men. Before the attack, he told his men, "You will, in actuality, attack the walls of a single city, but in that single city you will have made yourselves masters of all Spain." This was the first time that Scipio had commanded an army in battle, and he kept himself close to the fighting so that he could watch and direct his troops. The attack was a success, and the city was captured intact and with minimal Roman casualties. Scipio plundered the Carthaginian stores and treasures and freed a number of hostages taken from Spanish tribes to force their cooperation with the Carthaginians. Hostages were returned to the tribes from which they had been captured. Prisoners were treated well, and 10,000 prisoners who were citizens of New Carthage were released immediately and had their property and money returned. After the initial fighting, there was a minimum of looting and destruction by Roman troops, and this stopped completely when Scipio gave the order. This was a shrewd move on Scipio's part. The capture of a city in that time generally meant widespread looting and the massacre of its citizens. By keeping these things to a minimum, the Romans were treated by some people more as liberators than conquerors, and many Hispanic tribes that had previously been friendly to Carthage began to consider siding with Rome. He also pleased his troops by ensuring that the loot captured during the battle was fairly distributed, but they were less pleased when he demanded that they continue training after the battle the very next day. The legions were required to drill and undertake a 3.5-mile march in full armor. Scipio recognized that the capture of New Carthage was a major blow to his enemies, but his army was still outnumbered by the three Carthaginian armies, and there would be hard fighting ahead. Leaving a strong garrison to guard the captured city, he marched his army back to Tarraco. He continued his policy of seeking to persuade the allies of Carthage to transfer their allegiance to Rome, and in this, he was very successful during the winter of 209 and 208 BC. The capture of New Carthage was recognized as a vital development, because if the Carthaginians attacked the city, Scipio could fall upon their rear from Tarraco. If they attacked him in Tarraco, the army stationed in New Carthage could be called in for support. Faced with dwindling supplies, a lack of reinforcements, and the steady decline of support amongst the Hispanic tribes, the Carthaginians were left with little option but to attack Scipio. Even at this point, however, the Carthaginians were still operating as three separate armies and didn't bother gathering them into a single force. Thus, in early 208 BC, Hasdrubal Barca began to advance into the district of Castello with an army of around 30,000 men, comprised of both Carthaginian troops and warriors from allied Hispanic tribes. Scipio advanced to meet him with a force of a similar size, and, near the town of Baecula on the upper reaches of the Baetis River, the two forces met. This would be the first time that Scipio had commanded his army in open battle. Hearing of the approach of the Roman army, Hasdrubal drew up his force in a defensive position on a small but steep plateau backed by the river. The front of the plateau, the side facing the Roman army, had a distinct step, and on this lower step he placed a large force of light infantry while keeping his cavalry and the main bulk of his army on the top. Scipio first sent his velites against the troops on the lower step, and the better disciplined and trained Roman troops quickly drove the Carthaginian infantry back to the top of the plateau in disorder. The velites pursued, pressing forward to the top of the plateau. Scipio led half of his cavalry and heavy infantry on an attack on one flank of the plateau, while the other half simultaneously attacked the opposite side. Assailed on three sides, the Carthaginian force disintegrated. Around 8,000 Carthaginians were killed, and around 12,000 Carthaginians and Hispanic warriors surrendered. Roman losses were minimal. This was a very significant victory, and news of it led to wild celebration in Rome. The victory was only slightly tempered by news that Hasdrubal had survived the battle and fled into Gaul, from where he intended to march into Italy and join Hannibal. After the battle, Scipio returned to Tarraco and continued to gain the support of the Hispanic tribes. In this, he was very successful, aided by the fact that he had released all Hispanic prisoners taken at Becula. Still, the war in Hispania was far from over. Hasdrubal Gisco still commanded a powerful army in the port city of Gods, present-day Cadiz, and the relatively small force under the command of Mago Barca had been reinforced in early 207 BC by the arrival of fresh troops under the command of Carthaginian general Hanno. In the summer of that year, Hasdrubal Gisco advanced east into present-day Andalusia, establishing his army in a number of fortified cities. Mago, supported by Hanno, took over the defense of Gods. It was clear that Scipio would have to defeat both Carthaginian armies, but before he could even consider how to achieve that, he had first to contend with a mutiny within his own forces. Following his victory at the Battle of Becula, Scipio moved first to deal with two rebellious tribes in the area. Scipio sent one of his senior officers, Gaius Lucius Marcius Septimus, to complete the subjugation of Castulo, while he turned his attention to the larger illustrious tribe. This was not the first time that Scipio had delegated important actions to a subordinate, and this was something he was particularly adept at. Although this seems commonplace now, it was much less so in that period. Senior Roman commanders were also politicians, which meant they were very careful to ensure that their reputations were reinforced by all that happened on the battlefield. This led to a reluctance to delegate, in case a subordinate stole the commander's glory, and where important tasks were delegated, the commander would often downplay the importance of these in dispatches to Rome. It is a sign of Scipio's growing maturity, he was still just 28, that he was not only happy to delegate, but also gave his subordinates full credit when they performed well. In the attack on the city of the Illiturgus, Scipio showed that he was also becoming much more tactically aware than most contemporary Roman commanders. On approaching the city, he split his army into two, taking command of one half himself and placing the other half under the control of another subordinate and friend, Gaius Laelius. For such an attack to succeed by dividing the concentration of force by the defenders requires careful coordination of timing and absolute trust on the part of the overall commander in the subordinate who has control of the other half of the army. The attack was successful, the city was taken, and in an unusual display of harshness, Scipio had it utterly destroyed as an example to other tribes in the region. Scipio then returned to New Carthage, where he received welcome news. A deserter from Hanno's army had arrived in the city and was offering to provide details of the city's defenses. This would provide an attack on the city a good chance of success, and Scipio was keen to grasp the opportunity to seize the city, which represented the last Carthaginian port in Spain. Scipio immediately began planning for an assault on Gades, and the plan he developed was bold and extremely ambitious. He would send one part of his army by sea to assault the city from the seaward side, while the other marched the 400 miles to Gades and simultaneously attack from the landward side. This was tactically astute, but it would also be complex. Undeterred, Scipio did not hesitate to put the plan into operation. It seems likely that he intended to lead one half of the army himself, but around this time he was struck down by a serious illness and was forced to delegate, giving command of one half of the army to Gaius Laelius and the other to Gaius Lucius Marcius Septimus. While his subordinates marched towards Gades, the news of Scipio's illness spread, and soon this turned to rumors of his death. It seems that this rumor may have contributed to a mutiny of Roman troops in the town of Sucro, midway between Tarraco and New Carthage, and an important way station on the supply route between these cities. The men there were aggrieved that they had missed out on the loot from the capture of New Carthage and other cities, and, as was not uncommon in the Roman army, they had not been paid for several months. Believing Scipio to be dead, they threw their officers out of the camp and took control for themselves. This was a serious situation, as mutinies can spread fast, and it was imperative that Scipio quell it as quickly as possible. The normal reaction in the Roman army to any inclination to mutiny was instant and brutal punishment, but once again Scipio displayed a particular talent for motivating and controlling his troops. Recovered from his illness, he traveled to Sucro and had the mutineers drawn up in the town square, guarded by men from his own army. The mutineers were very surprised to see their commander alive and well, but even more surprised when he spoke to them. Instead of a short rebuke followed by mass executions and floggings, Scipio stood and looked at the men in silence for a long period before he finally began to speak. "Can I call you countrymen who have revolted from your country, or soldiers who have rejected the command and authority of your general and violated your solemn oath? Can I call you enemies? I recognize the persons, faces, and dress and mien of fellow countrymen, but I perceive the actions, expressions, and intentions of enemies." Then he addressed the issue of their grievance about the lack of pay. Mercenary troops may indeed sometimes be pardoned for revolting against their employers, but no pardon can be extended to those who are fighting for themselves and their wives and children. For that is just as if a man who said he had been wronged by his own father over money matters were to take up arms to kill him who was the author of his life. The speech to the mutineers was a perfectly pitched appeal to honor and duty. It ended with Scipio offering an amnesty to the mutineers with the exception of a few ringleaders. This was gladly accepted. The men swore to follow Scipio to the end, and the instigators of the mutiny were dragged into the square and promptly executed. In this speech to the mutineers, Scipio showed a real talent for oratory and for understanding not just how to make his men fight for him, but how to make them want to fight for him. When this was followed by a final battle in Spain that fully demonstrated Scipio's tactical genius, he would become the respected and revered of all Roman military commanders. The attack on Gades failed, and it was later discovered that the Carthaginians knew about the Roman plan. Without the advantage of surprise, the attack stood little chance of success, and the Roman army returned to New Carthage. In the spring of 206 BC, Mago Barca moved his army out of Gades and began to advance into Andalusia, while Hasdrubal Gisco advanced from the north. The two forces met at the town of Ilipa, a few kilometers north of present-day Seville. The combined Carthaginian army amounted to around 70,000 men, substantially outnumbering Scipio's forces. Scipio marched his army north to confront the Carthaginian force. As soon as Mago became aware that the Romans were in the area, he launched a surprise attack with the bulk of his cavalry. Carthaginian scouts had seen that the Roman infantry were unprotected by cavalry, and Mago hoped that this attack might severely weaken Scipio's army. However, Scipio had foreseen this move and concealed the bulk of his cavalry behind a low hill. When the Carthaginian cavalry attacked, they were taken by surprise by a Roman counterattack that smashed into their flank. The Carthaginian cavalry then withdrew in confusion and with heavy casualties. For the next 2 days, the rival armies maneuvered in sight of the other without entering battle, each trying to assess the strength of the other. On each occasion, Scipio arrayed his army in the same way, with the most powerful troops, the Roman legions, in the center, and the light infantry, mainly auxiliaries from friendly tribes, on the flanks. He knew that Mago and Hasdrubal would assume that this would be the formation he would use in the actual battle. Early the following morning, Scipio sent his cavalry to raid the Carthaginian camp, knowing that would bring his enemies out to face him. The Carthaginian force duly emerged and set out their battle lines. The strongest troops were in the center of the Carthaginian lines, where they expected to meet the Roman legions. However, the maneuvers of the previous days had been a deception. Scipio had always intended to array his army with the legions on the wings and the Iberian auxiliaries in the center. His plan was to execute a maneuver now referred to somewhat fittingly as a reverse Cannae, an advance where the wings of his army would move more quickly than the center, thereby enveloping the enemy wings before crushing the center. The plan worked flawlessly. The Carthaginian wings collapsed, and the legions began to close in on the center. It seems likely that a complete massacre was averted only when a torrential downpour temporarily prevented the maneuver and the remnants of the Carthaginian force were able to withdraw to their camp. Overnight, many of their Iberian allies deserted, and in the morning, the Carthaginian army withdrew to the north. Scipio pursued, caught, and attacked the army the following day. The dispirited Carthaginian army was virtually destroyed, and Mago and Hasdrubal fled with the only troops they had left, around 6,000 men, to a nearby mountaintop. Without food or water, their situation was hopeless. In short order, the remainder of the army surrendered, though not before Mago and Hasdrubal escaped. The Battle of Ilipa marked the effective end of organized Carthaginian resistance to the Roman occupation of Spain. Mago and Hasdrubal lost around 50,000 men in 4 days of fighting and maneuvering and were deserted by most of their allied tribes. Gades fell soon after, and when Scipio returned to Rome in early 205 BC, he was hailed as the greatest of all Roman generals. Taking the fight to Africa. On his return to Rome, Scipio was greeted by two very different responses to his victories in Spain. There was adulation from a large segment of the population, which regarded Scipio as a leader of genius and the only man capable of defeating the Carthaginians. However, there was also a large degree of envy, mainly from members of the Senate who saw Scipio's dramatic victories and his popularity with the ordinary people as a threat to their own prestige. Scipio was not yet 30 and had been successful where so many others had failed. But to some people, Scipio was nothing more than an upstart who had been lucky to achieve overrated victories against armies comprising mainly uneducated savages. This, of course, ignored the catastrophic military defeats the Carthaginians had inflicted on Rome before the emergence of Scipio as a leader, but the jealousy his success engendered would affect the remainder of his life and career. The greatest accolade that could be given to any Roman military leader was a triumph, a parade through the streets of Rome at the head of his army, followed by a retinue including important prisoners and loot. In general, this honor was accorded to a general on the successful conclusion of a war. If any general deserved such recognition, it was Scipio following his victories in Spain, but the Senate refused to grant him a triumph on a technicality. He had not previously served as a consul, usually a prerequisite for high military leadership. Scipio reacted by standing for the role of consul and was immediately and unanimously elected. This seems to have increased even further the resentment of some older senators to his meteoric rise to fame, especially a faction gathered round Fabius Maximus, the man who had briefly served as dictator when Hannibal's army threatened the city. Fabius Maximus had never engaged Hannibal in battle, preferring a strategy of attacking his supply lines and bases. The tactics, which are now appreciated as being wise, were not appreciated until well after Hannibal left Italy, and they led to the dictator being given the derogatory nickname cunctator, delayer. Upon his election as consul, Scipio quickly made it clear that his intention was to lead a Roman invasion of North Africa, the Carthaginian homeland, even though Hannibal was still in Italy. In the wake of the catastrophe at Cannae, the Roman ruling elite had re-evaluated Fabius Maximus's strategy and began to use his tactics to harass, delay, and whittle down Hannibal's forces in the field, studiously avoiding open battle whenever they could. For years they harried Hannibal's armies, and while there were blunders that allowed Hannibal to lash out, 3 Roman armies were destroyed in the period between 215 and 212 BC. The victories were minor and ultimately meaningless. After almost half a decade of continuous warfare, Apulia was a scorched desert, incapable of sustaining an army in the field, and Hannibal was getting no supplies either from his allies or from Carthage. Moreover, his allies were proving to be hopelessly ineffective in the field, meaning he either had to lead the force himself or risk losing one of his field armies. Whenever Hannibal did take command, the results were often devastating for Rome, but decisive victory eluded him. Rome could raise far more troops than Hannibal, unsupported, could ever hope to obtain, and a war of attrition was destined to favor them in the end. The tide was finally turning against Hannibal. In 211 BC, Hannibal received a massive blow as, while his army was in the field, the Romans besieged and captured his base at Capua. Still reeling from this news, his woes were compounded when he discovered that his Syracusan allies had also been crushed, with Sicily fallen to the Romans, and Philip, the king of Macedon, also defeated and driven out of the Roman dominions. Hannibal himself continued to prove himself a great general, inflicting several notable defeats upon all the armies sent against him, but they were, in the long term, meaningless. He fought on, but he continued to lose territories throughout the next few years, and by 207 BC, he was being pushed further south until finally being forced to retire to Apulia, where he anxiously awaited reinforcements under the command of his brother Hasdrubal. These reinforcements might have turned the tide, for once he had the troops at his command, Hannibal planned to march upon Rome once and for all, but Hasdrubal never reached Hannibal. He got himself entangled in a battle with the Romans on the Metaurus, and his army was defeated, and he was killed. Hannibal, knowing his situation in Apulia was untenable, was forced to retreat into Bruttium, the southernmost tip of the Italian peninsula, where he was also forced to endure the horror of having his brother's severed head tossed over the walls into his camp. For all intents and purposes, Hannibal's campaign in Italy was over. He succeeded in holding on in Bruttium for a further 4 years, but he was never able to push north, and his army was fast dwindling to nothing, with his veterans being killed off and his mercenaries melting away. In 206 BC, it was reported to him that Scipio's Roman armies had occupied the entirety of Iberia, driving the Carthaginian forces from the peninsula. Finally, in 203 BC, Hannibal was peremptorily recalled to Carthage, 15 years and scores of victories after he had first entered Italy in arms. The reason for his recall was simple. Rome was on the march, with a massive army under the command of Scipio preparing to attack and destroy Carthage. Initially, many in the Senate were critical of Scipio's bold strategy to invade Africa. Fabius Maximus asked, "Why do you not apply yourself to carry the war in a straightforward manner to the place where Hannibal is, rather than pursue that roundabout course, according to which you expect that when you have crossed into Africa, Hannibal will follow you thither?" Reacting to accusations that he was moved to oppose Scipio's proposed plan due to envy, he added dismissively, "What rivalry can there exist between myself and a man who is not equal in years even to my son?" He finished with a scathing attack on Scipio's motives. "You are going to leave Italy when Hannibal is there, not because you consider such a course beneficial to the state, but because you think it will redound to your honor and glory." Despite his earlier failure to defeat Hannibal, Fabius Maximus remained a respected senior member of the Senate as well as a skilled orator, and his arguments against Scipio carried weight. The Senate refused to sanction his plan to mount an invasion of Carthaginian North Africa and only grudgingly allowed that the consul with responsibility of the island of Sicily might choose to advance to Africa if he so wished, but that he would do so without any form of material or financial support from the Senate. Of course, the consul with responsibility for Sicily was Scipio himself. The Cornelii family rallied to support Scipio and raised sufficient money to gather, supply, and equip an army of 7,000 men and 70 warships. It was clear that this was much too small to take on the main Carthaginian force, but it did at least provide the nucleus of an army, and Scipio traveled to Sicily with these men. The island of Sicily had been under Roman control for several years, but it had become a place where disgruntled and disgraced soldiers were sent as a punishment. Many survivors from Roman military defeats, such as Ticinus and Cannae, had been sent to languish in the garrison on Sicily. However, Scipio was astute enough to understand that these battles had not been lost because of a want of courage or ability on the part of these troops, but failures on the part of their commanders. Moreover, he understood that these men were desperate to assuage the shame associated with involvement in these defeats. Instead of regarding the soldiers on Sicily as hopeless rejects, Scipio saw them as experienced men strongly motivated to perform well in battle. The garrison on Sicily would become the heart of the army with which he would attack Africa. One major problem for Scipio was a complete lack of cavalry, something that the Carthaginians always had. The Senate refused to provide him with cavalry, and the expense to raise and outfit cavalry was beyond the means even of his wealthy supporters. His solution was novel. He demanded that several hundred sons of noble Sicilian families gather to be pressed into service with the Roman military as cavalry. On the given day, the youths gathered, but it was clear that they were not in the least enthusiastic about joining Scipio's army. One asked how he might be excused from performing this service. Scipio replied that anyone who did not wish to join his army was free to leave, provided that each paid for the provision of a horse, equipment, and fodder. All gladly agreed, and Scipio found himself with several hundred horses on which he mounted Roman troops, all at no expense to the Senate. In 204 BC, Scipio and his army sailed from Sicily and landed near the Carthaginian city of Utica, in the present-day Bizerte Governorate in Tunisia. For the first time, Rome would take the fight to the Carthaginian homeland, and Scipio would earn the name by which he has become known to history. Scipio's first priority after landing in Africa was to capture a city with a port that he could use to bring in supplies for his men and reinforcements. There is some debate about the size of the army he brought to Africa, though the most commonly agreed figure is around 16,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. While this was not an inconsiderable force, it was much smaller than the Carthaginian armies he could expect to face. He first used his men to lay siege to the coastal city of Utica, but this proved much more difficult to capture than he had anticipated. For more than a month, the Romans mounted attacks on the city, but each time they were repulsed, and ultimately, before Utica could be taken, Scipio was forced to break off to deal with a more pressing danger. The Carthaginians had recently concluded an alliance with the powerful Numidian king Syphax. The relationship between the Numidians and Rome had been extremely complex since the beginning of the current war. Syphax was the king of the western Numidians, and his most important rivals in the region were the eastern Numidians under King Galla. In 213 BC, Syphax had concluded an alliance with Rome and in return received help in training and equipping his army. However, when King Galla died in early 206 BC, a squabble over succession between his sons weakened the eastern Numidian army, and King Syphax was able to seize large parts of their territory. The new king of the eastern Numidians, Massinissa, then quickly concluded an alliance with Rome. Having lost this ally, Carthage sent Hasdrubal Gisco, who had escaped from Spain following the defeat at the Battle of Alypa, as an emissary to King Syphax to try to persuade him to switch sides. Partly by promising the Numidian king marriage to his daughter Sophonisba, who had previously been promised to King Massinissa, Hasdrubal was able to persuade King Syphax to become an ally of Carthage. This was a major threat to Scipio, who now faced not just the army of Carthage, but also the powerful western Numidian army. While the siege of Utica was still in progress, Scipio learned that a combined Carthaginian-Numidian army of up to 80,000 men was advancing along the coast towards him. Knowing that his army was too small to meet this force in open battle, despite having been bolstered by a force of Numidians under the command of King Massinissa, Scipio devised a plan. The combined army of Syphax and Hasdrubal had established a winter camp from which they intended to attack the Romans in the spring. But Scipio knew that Syphax was not particularly enthusiastic about a war with Rome and would be prepared to discuss peace terms. Envoys were sent by Scipio to the camp to meet with Syphax and Hasdrubal. However, the real purpose of this was to allow a number of Roman officers, dressed as servants, to roam freely through the camp of King Syphax. They mapped its layout and discovered that it comprised mainly wooden buildings. After that, Scipio took his army out under cover of darkness and approached the camps of Hasdrubal and Syphax. He split his army, leaving his trusted subordinate Gaius Laelius, who had accompanied him from Spain, to attack the camp of Syphax, while Scipio himself led the attack on Hasdrubal's camp. The Romans set fire to outlying buildings, and the fire quickly spread through the flammable wooden buildings. Many soldiers died in their sleeping quarters, and many more were trampled to death as they fled from the flames. The survivors, disorganized and largely unarmed, fled into the desert, only to be pursued and massacred by the Romans. No one is quite certain of casualties, but it has been suggested that as many as 50,000 may have died that night, with several thousand more captured, including a number of Carthaginian nobles. This was a crushing blow to the Carthaginian-Numidian alliance, though both Syphax and Hasdrubal escaped. Freed from this immediate threat, Scipio returned to the siege of the city of Utica in order to turn it into a Roman supply center, while news of the massacre of the combined army caused alarm and despondency in Carthage. Some nobles proposed making peace with Rome on whatever terms were offered, and some demanded the recall of Hannibal and his army from Italy. But eventually it was decided to raise a new army and to send that to confront Scipio. Thus, in the summer of 203 BC, Syphax and Hasdrubal found themselves leading a new army that included a large number of Celtiberians and Spanish mercenaries brought in to supplement the Carthaginians. They marched the new army towards Utica and the Roman force. Scipio moved out quickly to meet this new threat, and the two opposing armies finally met in battle on an open plain near the Bagratis River, and once again, Scipio's tactical brilliance would prove decisive. The army he faced was drawn up with the strongest troops, the Celtiberians, in the center surrounded by Numidians on their left and Carthaginians on their right. Facing this, Scipio placed his legions in the center with Roman cavalry on his right, facing the Numidians and the forces of his ally King Massinissa on his left, facing the Carthaginians. First, Scipio sent his Roman cavalry and the forces of King Massinissa against the wings of the opposing army, which quickly broke and retreated in disorder. Then he moved his legions forward to attack the main body of Celtiberian infantry while they were simultaneously attacked on both flanks by the Numidians and the Roman cavalry. Attacked on three sides, the Celtiberians stood no chance and were hacked to pieces by the bold attack. Those who weren't killed or surrendered fled in disorder, with Hasdrubal taking the bad news back to Carthage and Syphax retreating to his capital of Cirta. Syphax was pursued by King Massinissa, supported by a small Roman army under the command of Gaius Laelius. Syphax was finally defeated in a battle near Cirta, during which he was also badly wounded. King Massinissa was given control of the western Numidian provinces, and the wounded Syphax died in Roman captivity later in 203 BC. If the Carthaginians had been worried before, news of this further defeat and the loss of their Numidian ally caused something close to despair. At first, the Carthaginians considered peace talks, and Scipio proposed very reasonable terms. The talks were continuing, and ambassadors were returning to Carthage with Scipio's terms, when suddenly the Senate of Carthage broke off talks and did precisely what Scipio had predicted to the Roman Senate. They recalled Hannibal and his army from Italy to defend Carthage. Finally, the two most successful military leaders of the period would meet in battle. Thus, even while negotiations were continuing between ambassadors from Carthage and the Roman Senate, Hannibal set sail from Italy with his forces. In Rome, there was jubilation that the threat represented by Hannibal had finally left the Italian peninsula, but also some apprehension. After all, Scipio's invading force would now have to deal with Carthage's greatest general, and Scipio's situation when he heard of the arrival of Hannibal was not particularly strong. Ships bringing him supplies and reinforcements from Sicily had been caught in a storm, leading to many being sunk or captured by the Carthaginians. His ally, King Massinissa, was still busy reconquering the territory held by Syphax, and he had with him 10 cohorts of the Roman army. All of this had left Scipio short of men and supplies, and his initial goal of laying siege to Carthage before Hannibal arrived was impossible with the forces at his disposal. Instead, he marched his army to an area inland from Carthage, intending to cut the city off from its overland supply routes from Africa. Hannibal landed with 24,000 men in Leptis, in present-day Libya. He then marched on to Hadrumetum, present-day Sousse in Tunisia. On the way, he was joined by 2,000 cavalry provided by another Numidian chief, Tychius, and by around 12,000 Gauls and Spanish mercenaries who had formerly been part of Mago's army in Liguria. Hannibal's destination was Carthage itself. With this powerful army within the city, he could not only defend it easily, he could leave at a time of his choosing and engage the Roman army in battle. Scipio knew that if there was to be any chance of defeating Hannibal, he had engaged Hannibal before the Carthaginian army reached Carthage. In moving his army inland from Carthage, Scipio hoped that this would persuade Hannibal to march west to meet him rather than north to Carthage. He also knew that placing himself inland from Carthage put him closer to his ally King Massinissa, who he hoped would be able to join him before he engaged Hannibal. This worked perfectly, as the Senate in Carthage sent urgent messages to Hannibal asking him to engage Scipio in order to allow overland supplies to get through to Carthage. Hannibal marched his army west, and he would meet the Romans on open, flat plains at Zama in present-day Tunisia. The two armies were fairly evenly matched. Hannibal's army comprised around 36,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, supported by 80 fearsome war elephants. Scipio had been reinforced by the arrival of King Massinissa with 6,000 men, so he had just under 30,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Hannibal lined up the main body of his army in 3 lines behind his war elephants, and on each flank he placed cavalry, Numidian on one side and Carthaginian on the other. Scipio adopted a similar formation, with his infantry drawn up in 3 lines in the center, with Numidian cavalry under Massinissa on the right, and Roman cavalry under Gaius Laelius on the left. Scipio's main concern was the war elephants, which were virtually unstoppable and were easily capable of smashing through his lines. However, though the elephants were powerful, they were difficult to maneuver. Once they were moving in a straight line, they were difficult to turn. To counter the threat of the elephants, Scipio devised a brilliant plan. He believed that if the charging elephants saw gaps in the lines ahead of them, they would tend to follow these rather than attempt to push through the massed formations. He therefore included wide, empty lanes between his formations, which he concealed from the enemy by initially filling them with skirmishers. As the battle began, Hannibal unleashed the war elephants, intending to disrupt the Roman formations before his infantry engaged. But upon a signal from Scipio, the skirmishers withdrew into the main formations, and the war elephants plunged through the gaps in the Roman lines without causing major disruption. They were harried and pursued behind the lines by archers and javelin throwers, while the Roman cavalry blew trumpets to confuse and frighten the elephants, several of which turned the way they had come and charged into the Carthaginian left flank, creating chaos there. The elephants would not play much of a role in the battle. Massinissa took advantage of this to charge home against the cavalry on that flank and drive it from the field, but he found himself embroiled in a chase orchestrated on the fly by Hannibal as the Carthaginian cavalry lured him away from the main battle. As a result, the Battle of Zama became a brutal contest of strength between Carthaginian and Roman infantry, both supported by cavalry attacking the flanks and rear. The Roman and Carthaginian infantry hammered each other in the center of the lines, with both sides momentarily gaining the advantage, only to be driven back in turn. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain the upper hand, but eventually Massinissa, who had chased the Carthaginian cavalry clean off the field with his superior numbers, returned and charged the Carthaginian forces from behind, enveloping them. Scipio rallied his faltering and exhausted troops to one last great effort, and they fell upon the Carthaginian troops, which were trapped and unable to maneuver. Like Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae, but this time with the roles inverted, the encircled force had nowhere to run. Thousands were cut down where they stood, with only around 10% of Hannibal's original force, including Hannibal himself, succeeding in breaking free and escaping. Around 20,000 Carthaginians died that day, and about 20,000 more surrendered to Scipio. The remainder, including Hannibal, fled back to Carthage. With this decisive Roman victory, the Second Punic War was effectively over. Left with little option, Carthage sued for peace. This was granted, but on terms so harsh that Carthage would never again be a threat to Rome. Now that Carthage had surrendered virtually all military ambition, Hannibal himself devoted himself to politics. He secured his election to chief magistrate through political supporters and introduced highly successful political and financial reforms, much to the chagrin of his rivals. Hannibal was so successful as a politician that Carthage, despite still being hampered by a heavy war indemnity, prospered to the point that the Romans demanded he step down as magistrate. Rather than do so, Hannibal voluntarily went into exile, worried he might expose Carthage to new Roman reprisals. Despite the smattering of defeats he accumulated later on in his career, Hannibal was unquestionably one of the most brilliant generals in ancient history, with a record unmatched by anyone except arguably Alexander the Great and Caesar. However, as Maharbal allegedly remarked, Hannibal seemed to know how to win a battle, but not how to completely capitalize off of it. Half a dozen times during the course of his Italian campaign, he could have marched on Rome and perhaps ended the war with a Carthaginian victory, but for various reasons he chose not to do so. Much of the blame for these decisions lies with the indecisiveness of the Carthaginian oligarchy, but Hannibal must bear his own portion of responsibility. Nevertheless, despite these perceived failings, Hannibal was truly a figure who loomed larger than life. His decades of relentless fighting against Rome transformed him into a monster in their eyes, with virtually no Roman family who could claim that they had not lost a family member to Hannibal's forces. It is telling that no matter how badly Hannibal defeated the Romans, they despised him so greatly that the Senate refused to negotiate with him, even from a position of great weakness. Hannibal was Rome's bogeyman, and long after his time, whenever Rome faced a disaster, Roman senators would describe the disaster as Hannibal ante portas, Hannibal before the gates. It is perhaps the greatest testament to his generalship and his character that the Romans themselves erected a statue of him in their forum, making clear that they considered their victory in the Second Punic War to be their greatest accomplishment to date. The greatest boast a Roman soldier could make, even in defeat, was that he fought against Hannibal. Of course, Hannibal's legacy extended far beyond personality and psychology. There is a universal consensus that Hannibal was one of the greatest generals in history, and arguably the greatest. During the American Civil War, the Lincoln administration was greatly concerned about General William Tecumseh Sherman cutting his supply lines and marching through enemy territory without any lines of communication for 3 months in late 1864. It was possible to assuage those concerns by pointing to the fact that Hannibal's armies stayed in Italy without Carthage's help for the better part of 2 decades. In the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, Maximilian Otto Bismarck Caspari noted, As to the transcendent military genius of Hannibal, there cannot be two opinions. The man who for 15 years could hold his ground in a hostile country against several powerful armies and a succession of able generals must have been a commander and a tactician of supreme capacity. In the use of strategies and ambuscades, he certainly surpassed all other generals of antiquity. Wonderful as his achievements were, we must marvel the more when we take into account the grudging support he received from Carthage. As his veterans melted away, he had to organize fresh levies on the spot. We never hear of a mutiny in his army, composed though it was of North Africans, Iberians, and Gauls. Again, all we know of him comes for the most part from hostile sources. The Romans feared and hated him so much that they could not do him justice. Livy speaks of his great qualities, but he adds that his vices were equally great, among which he singles out his more than Punic perfidy and an inhuman cruelty. For the first, there would seem to be no further justification than that he was consummately skillful in the use of ambuscades. For the latter, there is, we believe, no more ground than that at certain crises he acted in the general spirit of ancient warfare. Sometimes he contrasts most favorably with his enemy. No such brutality stains his name as that perpetrated by Claudius Nero on the vanquished Hasdrubal. Polybius merely says that he was accused of cruelty by the Romans and of avarice by the Carthaginians. He had indeed bitter enemies, and his life was one continuous struggle against destiny. For steadfastness of purpose, for organizing capacity and a mastery of military science, he has perhaps never had an equal. Whether Hannibal is the greatest general ever, or merely one of the greatest, makes for a good armchair debate, but regardless of his ranking, his influence on military tactics is undeniable. In particular, Hannibal demonstrated that warfare was about more than superior tactics in battle, because his success owed as much to his strategic outmaneuvering of his enemies. As historian Theodore Dodge put it, Hannibal excelled as a tactician. No battle in history is a finer sample of tactics than Cannae, but he was yet greater in logistics and strategy. No captain ever marched to and fro among so many armies of troops superior to his own numbers and material as fearlessly and skillfully as he. No man ever held his own so long or so ably against such odds. Constantly overmatched by better soldiers, led by generals always respectable, often of great ability, he yet defied all their efforts to drive him from Italy for half a generation. Excepting in the case of Alexander, and some few isolated instances, all wars up to the Second Punic War had been decided largely, if not entirely, by battle tactics. Strategic ability had been comprehended only on a minor scale. Armies had marched towards each other, had fought in parallel order, and the conqueror had imposed terms on his opponent. Any variation from this rule consisted in ambuscades or other stratagems. That war could be waged by avoiding in lieu of seeking battle. That the results of a victory could be earned by attacks upon the enemy's communications, by flank maneuvers, by seizing positions from which safely to threaten him in case he moved, and by other devices of strategy, was not understood. Hannibal has always had his share of admirers in the centuries that followed, from Schlieffen to George Patton, but once again the greatest tribute to his ultimate military legacy was paid by Rome. Understanding Hannibal better than anyone, Rome completely adjusted the way it conducted war after the Battle of Cannae. At Cannae, the Roman infantry used the phalanx formation popularized by the Greeks, but that massed formation proved incapable of maneuvering once enveloped in Hannibal's pincer assault. Moreover, the Romans had their high command alternate between two consuls at the head of the army, which made for a poor and confusing line of chain of command. After Cannae, Rome reorganized their units so that they could mass together like a traditional phalanx but retain independent maneuverability by splitting into columns. Rome also did away with the binary leadership command structure and began relying on more professional forces instead of citizen armies. The effects these changes had on Rome's destiny cannot be understated. Rome turned itself into the greatest military machine on the planet over the next several centuries, and having one consul at the head of legions instead of two, created army loyalties to the consul in command instead of Rome itself. This inevitably laid the groundwork for the civil wars that led to Caesar's destruction of the Roman Republic and the implementation of the Roman Empire. Thus, ironically, it was another of antiquity's greatest generals, Caesar, who fulfilled Hannibal's goal of destroying the Roman Republic as a result of Roman changes made in response to the carnage Hannibal inflicted upon them. Hannibal would certainly have relished that as his ultimate legacy. That was Hamilcar and Hannibal, the history of the Carthaginian generals who brought Rome to its knees. Written by Charles River editors. Narrated by Michelle Humphreys.